Hey there, and welcome back. If you are settling in now, lights low, the day finally loosening its hold on you, the room going still around you, then you are exactly where you should be, because tonight asks almost nothing of you. It asks only that you lie still and let the centuries fall away, and let yourself be carried a very long way from here, down a track that has not existed in its old form for 600 years. Tonight, we are going to walk to Canterbury, not in a car and not in an afternoon. We are going to do it the way it was once done on foot over 4 days, along the 60 miles of old track that run east out of London, through the orchards and chalk downs of Kent. We are going to set out before first light from an inn on the wrong side of the river, in a company of strangers who will have become, by the end of it, something close to friends. We are going to feel the road under our feet, and the weight of the pack on our shoulders, and the rain down the back of our necks. And somewhere near the end, after days of mud and aching feet, we are going to come over the brow of a low hill in the last of the afternoon light, and see far off across the valley the towers of the great cathedral rising into the sky. I will tell you now, though I will not yet tell you quite why, that men and women who had walked that whole way without shedding a tear would stand at the top of that hill and weep at the sight of it. We are going to find out what it cost them to get there, and we are going to find out why they came. Before we take the first step, one small and quiet thing. People have always travelled this kind of road in company, rather than alone. And I find these evenings are a little like that. A scattered band of people, all across the world, walking the same dark path at the same hour. I like knowing where in the world you are setting out from tonight, and what the hour is where you are. So if you feel moved to leave that below, I do read them, and I like knowing who else is on the route. And if these long journeys into the past are something you would care to find your way back to, you are welcome to come along again, and the next one will find you when it is ready. That is all. No hurry. We have a long way to go, and the whole night to do it in. So, picture this. It is a little before dawn, on a morning in the spring of the year, somewhere in the last decades of the 14th century. The exact year does not matter much, because mornings like this one happened in their thousands, across the better part of 300 years. You are standing in the yard of an inn on the south bank of the Thames. In the crowded sprawl of taverns and tanneries and tenements they call Southwark, just over the river from the walled city of London. The inn is called the Tabard, and at this hour its yard is the only lit thing in a dark and waking world. A lantern hangs from a beam by the stable door. The cobbles are wet from the night, and they throw the lantern light back in long smears. The air smells of horse and wood smoke, and the river, which is close enough that you can hear it moving, that vast brown tidal river, sliding past in the dark, carrying the smell of mud and salt and the sea that lies somewhere far to the east, in the direction you are about to walk. You are not alone. That is the first thing to understand about a morning like this. Around you in the yard, by ones and twos, the company is gathering. They have come down to Southwark over the past day or so, most of them across the great stone bridge with its houses leaning over the water, the only dry crossing of the Thames for miles. And they have taken beds here at the Tabard, precisely because it sits at the head of the road they all mean to take. There is a knight, perhaps, lean and weathered, who has done this kind of journey before in harder country than Kent. There is a merchant in good wool with an eye that prices everything it sees, and his wife beside him, already certain of her opinions about the breakfast. There is a widow of comfortable means, travelling with a maid and a great deal of quiet authority. There is a miller, broad as a door and twice as loud. There is a parish priest, threadbare and gentle, who has saved for 2 years to make this journey once. There is a young couple, newly married holding hands when they think no one is looking. There are craftsmen and a cook and a sailor far from his ship, and one or two whose business you cannot read at all and would be wiser not to ask about. They are gentle and common, rich and poor, devout and frankly not, and in the ordinary run of their lives they would never sit at the same table. But the road is about to do something strange to all of them, which it has done to everyone who ever travelled it. It is about to make them, for a few days, equal. On the road to Canterbury there is no high table and no low. There is only the track and the weather and the miles still to walk, and the company you walk them with, and every one of them, however different, is here for the same reason, or behind their many reasons there is one. They are going to see a dead man, or rather, they are going to see what is left of him and to ask him for something. His name was Thomas Becket, and 2 centuries before this morning he had been Archbishop of Canterbury, and he had quarrelled with his king. And on a December evening in the year 1174, knights had ridden to Canterbury and cut him down with their swords on the stone steps inside his own cathedral, in the dark while he prayed. Within days, ordinary people were creeping into the cathedral to dip cloths in his blood. Within years, the sick who touched those cloths were said to be healed. Within a lifetime, Thomas of Canterbury had become the most famous saint in England and one of the most famous in all of Europe. And his shrine had become a place that people would walk for days and sometimes for weeks, simply to kneel in front of, and so they are here. The widow comes because she made a vow at her husband's deathbed and means to keep it. The merchant is here partly for his soul and partly because it is good for a man in his position to be seen to have gone. The priest comes because he has wanted to, with his whole heart, since he was a boy. The young wife comes carrying a hope she has told no one, not even her husband, and she will carry it the whole way to the shrine and lay it down there. And somewhere among them is a man or a woman carrying a sin so heavy that a confessor has told them plainly there is only one road left that leads out from under it, and it is this one, and it ends 60 miles away, at the feet of the murdered saint. That is the company, that is the why. The light is beginning to rise grey over the rooftops now, and somewhere across the river a bell has started to ring for the first office of the day. And in the inn-yard, the host is moving among them, counting heads, because a company that travels together must agree to leave together, and the hour is nearly upon them. In a few moments we are going to shoulder our packs and step out through the gate and onto the highway. But before we do, I want to show you exactly what each of these people is carrying, because what a pilgrim took on their back tells you almost everything about the journey ahead, and about how little, in the end, they expected to be able to rely on along the way. Look first at the staff. Nearly everyone in the yard is holding one, leaning on it, and it is the single most recognizable thing a pilgrim owns. It is a stout pole of ash or oak, taller than a walking stick, often as tall as the person who carries it. Sometimes shod with iron at the foot, and sometimes capped with a knob or a small hook near the top, where a bundle or a flask can hang. A traveller will lean their whole weight on it by the end of a day. They will use it to test the depth of a ford, to steady themselves down a muddy slope, to fend off the farm dogs that come snarling out at every village, and if it comes to that, against worse than dogs. There is an old joke, repeated for centuries, that a pilgrim's staff and a pilgrim's prayers are the two things that keep them safe on the road, and that the wise pilgrim keeps a firm grip on both. To the people watching from doorways as the company passes, the staff is a signal. It says, "This person is under the protection of the church and bound for a holy place, and to rob them or harm them is a sin beyond the ordinary." It did not always work, but it meant something. Then look at the scrip. It is the small, soft leather bag, like a satchel or a wallet, slung on a strap across the body, and it holds everything the pilgrim cannot do without. It is deliberately not large. A pilgrim was meant to travel light, partly from necessity and partly from principle, because the whole point of the journey was to strip life back to the bone and arrive at the shrine with nothing between yourself and your purpose. So in the scrip there is bread and hard cheese and perhaps a few strips of dried or salted meat, enough for a day, because you do not carry 4 days of food. You trust to buy or beg the rest along the way. There is a wooden bowl and a horn spoon and a knife, because an inn will give you a place at the fire and a share of the pot, but the vessel you eat from is your own. There is a leather bottle for ale or water. There are the beads of a paternoster, a loop of wooden or bone beads run through the fingers to count out prayers, because the road is long and the praying of it is half the point. And there is money, though not in the scrip where a cut purse could find it. Money is sewn into a hidden seam, or carried in a pouch worn under the clothes against the skin. Because everyone on this route has heard the stories of what happens to a careless purse. Over the shoulders goes the cloak, a heavy thing of coarse wool, often greasy with lanolin, so the rain runs off it rather than soaking through, and it is cloak and blanket and ground sheet all in one. At night, in a strange place, it is what you wrap yourself in. In the rain, it is your roof. And on the head sits the hat, the famous broad-brimmed pilgrim hat, low-crowned and wide, made of felt or coarse straw, and its brim is not for fashion. It keeps the sun off in summer and the rain off the neck the rest of the year, and turned up at the front, it becomes the place where a pilgrim pins the proudest thing they own. For the badges go on the hat. A pilgrim who has been to a shrine before will wear the sign of it, a little stamped emblem of lead and tin, pinned to the brim or sewn to the cloak. A scallop shell for one who has walked to Compostela in distant Spain. A small flask for one who has been to Canterbury already. A palm for one who has somehow reached Jerusalem. To wear these is to say, without a word, I have done this before. I know this road. Follow me. And every soul in this yard is hoping, by the end of the week, to have earned one more. That is the whole of it. A staff, a bag, a cloak, a hat, a little food, a little money, and a string of beads. It is almost nothing. You could carry the lot and still have a hand free. And that is the point I want you to hold on to as we step out of the gate, because it tells you the truth of what this journey was. These people are about to walk 60 miles through open country with what amounts to a day's supplies, and they are going to do it on the strength of 2 things. The road's network of inns and abbeys and hospitals that had grown up over centuries precisely to feed and shelter travellers like them, and the deep, unspoken assumption that strangers owed one another bread and a roof in God's name. They are walking out into the world with almost empty hands, trusting it to fill them. Whether it was the question every morning answered fresh. And now the host has finished his count, and the gate is open, and the road is waiting. Come on, we are going. We go out through the gate of the Tabard and turn left, eastward, away from the bridge and the city behind us, onto the track that the whole of England simply called the way to Canterbury. The first thing you notice is the smell of Southwark in the morning, which is a great deal, and not much of it pleasant. The tanneries that need the river, the breweries, the stews, the open kennels running down the middle of the street, where every household empties what it would rather not keep. Southwark is the place the city pushed its messier trades across the water to be rid of. And at this hour, it is a town of shutters coming down, and fires being lit, and apprentices throwing the night slops into the street, with no warning at all. So you learn quickly to walk in the middle and look up before you pass a window. The company moves in a loose knot, the riders at a walk among the walkers, because no one is going to gallop off and leave the rest. The whole point being to stay together. And for the first mile or two, the talk is loud and easy, because everyone is fresh and the legs do not hurt yet and the day is new. About 2 miles out, where the buildings begin to thin and the open fields of Kent start to show between them, the road dips to cross a small brook, and here the company slows and stops. This is the watering of St. Thomas, and it is a real place marked on the highway for centuries, where travellers paused to let the horses drink before the country opened up in earnest. It is in a quiet way the true beginning of the pilgrimage, the gate between the town and the route. Some of the company say a short prayer here. Some simply rest a moment and look back at the smoke of London hanging over the river behind them, knowing it is the last they will see of home for a week or more. And then somebody, the host most likely, says it is time, and the company turns its back on the city for good and walks on into the rising sun. We are on the track now, we are really on it, and the first thing the road teaches you is how slow it is. Because here is the truth of medieval travel that is almost impossible to feel from inside a world of engines. It was the speed of a human body and nothing faster. A person on foot, carrying a pack, on a highway that is mud half the year, covers somewhere between 15 and 20 miles in a day, and at the end of it, they are done. A whole day's hard walking takes you a distance you could now drive in 20 minutes. The horse riders among the company are not much quicker because they hold their pace to the walkers, and because a horse on a bad route is a fragile and expensive thing you do not risk for the sake of an hour. So the day stretches out ahead at the pace of an amble, a swinging, rolling, unhurried gait that eats the miles without seeming to. And the great lesson of the first morning is that you cannot hurry it. There is no point straining ahead. The road will take the time it takes. And there is something in that, something the modern world has almost entirely lost, where the only way forward is your own 2 feet, and the only speed available is the speed of your own body, so that the distance to Canterbury is measured not in miles, but in days, in dawns and dusks, in the slow turning of the land around you. You stop fighting it after the first hour. You give yourself up to the pace, and once you do, the track becomes not a thing to be got through, but a thing to be lived in. Look down at it now, the highway itself, because it is not what you might imagine. We have a picture in our heads of a neat country lane, and this is nothing of the sort. In law, it is the King's Highway, and that phrase matters because the highway was under the special protection of the Crown, and to commit a crime upon it was a worse offence than the same crime elsewhere. The road was meant to be a place of the King's peace, where travel could happen safely. In practice, what is under your feet is the long ghost of something the Romans built more than 1,000 years before. This is Watling Street, one of the great routes the legions ran out across Britain, straight as a spear from the coast at Dover, up through Canterbury and Rochester, to London and on to the far northwest. And in its day, it was a marvel of engineering, raised on a bank, paved with dressed stone, drained and cambered, so the water ran off. But that was 1,000 years ago, and no one since has had the wealth or the will to keep a track like that whole. So what remains is patches. Here and there, especially on the higher ground, you walk on the old Roman stone, worn and rutted, but still there under the grass, and the going is firm and good. And then the old surface gives out, and you are on bare earth that 10 centuries of cartwheels and hooves and feet have churned into a broad, braided scar across the landscape. A road that is less a line than a zone. Because when the middle becomes an impassable bog of mud, everyone simply walks a little to the side, and the side becomes mud in its turn. until the road is 50 feet wide and every foot of it has been somebody's path at some point. And so you learn to read it. You learn that the crown of the root sheds water and the edges hold it. You learn which ruts are old and dry and which are new and treacherous. You learn that after rain, the clay of the Kentish low ground turns to a sucking porridge that pulls the shoe half off your foot, and that the chalk of the high downs drains fast and walks hard and clean, so that you come to long for the hills. You learn to watch for the place where a cart has gone over and left a pit, and for the loose stone that turns an ankle. There is one thing more to notice, and it is a thing put there on purpose by the law. Along the better stretches of the highway, the ground to either side has been cleared, the trees felled back, the brush and the dikes cut away for a good distance from the road. This was the king's law, laid down a century before our morning, that the verges of the great tracks between market towns be cleared of cover for 200 feet on each side, so that robbers would have nowhere to lie in wait and spring out upon travellers. Whether it worked we shall come to, but it tells you something true about the highway, that the law itself understood it to be dangerous, and had tried, in its blunt medieval way, to make the danger a little less. For now the sun is up, the verges are clear, the company is in good spirits, and the way runs east before us, broad and rutted and full of strangers. Let me show you who they are. There is a reason these people are walking together, and it is not only company, it is survival. A lone traveller on a medieval track was a frightened thing, exposed to every danger the road could offer, with no one to call out for, and no one to lift them if they fell. A company of 20 or 30 was a different proposition entirely. There was strength in the numbers, real strength, of the kind that makes a band of robbers think twice and move on to easier prey. There were extra hands if a horse went lame or a cart stuck fast. There was someone who knew the highway if you did not. Someone who had a remedy for blistered feet. Someone who could set a bone or bring down a fever or, at the last, hear a confession and say the words over a body. And so people did not simply happen to travel together, they sought one another out, gathered at the great staging inns like the Tabard, precisely so as to leave in numbers, and bound themselves loosely under a leader, often the innkeeper or a senior pilgrim, who would set the pace and settle the disputes and decide each evening how far they had come and how far they would go tomorrow. To join a company was to enter, for the length of the road, a little travelling republic with its own rules. And what a strange republic it was, because the route did the one thing medieval society almost never did, which was to mix the ranks together and make them speak. Look at them strung out along the way now. The knight rides near the front, and the merchant's wife in her good red wool walks not far behind, and the miller bellows a song from somewhere in the middle of the pack, and the threadbare priest keeps pace with a ploughman, and the fine widow finds, to her own surprise, that she is deep in conversation with a sailor about the best cure for seasickness, which she has never suffered and never will. In their ordinary lives, these people lived in separate worlds, ate in separate rooms, married within their own kind, and would have thought it odd or improper to share a table. On the road, all of that thinned to almost nothing. They ate from the same pot at the same inn, slept under the same roof, faced the same rain, and shared the one thing that flattens every difference, which is a destination they all wanted equally, and a distance they all had to cover on the same two legs. The track was one of the very few places in the medieval world where a duchess and a dyer might genuinely talk. So how did they fill the hours with 60 slow miles to walk and nothing to do but walk them? They talked. They talked endlessly, because talk is the one thing that makes the miles go, and a good talker was worth more to a company than a strong walker. They told stories, And we know they did, because one of the greatest poems in the English language is little more than a record of the stories a company like this one told to pass the time, each pilgrim taking a turn, the bawdy ones and the holy ones and the ones meant to make a rival look a fool. They argued about scripture and about the price of wool and about whose home county made the better ale. They sang, because singing keeps a tired body moving when nothing else will, and a road song with a rolling rhythm and a chorus that everyone knows can carry a footsore company up a slope they would never have managed in silence. And in between, there were the long, easy stretches where nobody said anything at all, where the only sounds were feet on the highway and bird song from the cleared verges and the creak of harness, and the company walked wrapped in its own thoughts. Together and alone at the same time, in the particular companionable quiet that only comes from having walked a long way beside someone. By the end of the first day, faces that were strangers at dawn have names. By the end of the second, they have stories. By the end of the road, some of them have friends they will write to for the rest of their lives. And one or two, it must be said, have rather more than that. Because the road has always been a place where things happen that would not happen at home. There is one thing the company has to do that we, who have never lived without a map, can barely imagine, and that is simply to know where they are going. Stop and think about it for a moment. There is no signpost at the crossroads. There is no map in anyone's hand. Maps existed, a few great and beautiful ones drawn for kings and scholars. But no ordinary traveller had ever seen one, and would not have known how to read it if they had. There is no agreed name for half the places, no numbering of the distances, nothing written down that an unlettered ploughman could use even if he could read, which he cannot. So how, across 60 miles of branching tracks and forking paths, does a company find Canterbury and not wander off into the marshes of the Thames estuary or the forests of the Weald? The answer is a layered thing, and it is wonderful in its way. First and simplest, you follow the road that everyone else is following, because the way to Canterbury is one of the most trodden highways in England, worn deep and broad by centuries of feet, and at most hours of a spring day there are other travellers on it going the same direction, so that the route half navigates itself. Second, you ask at every village of every carter and shepherd and good wife at a door, which way to the next town, and people tell you, because everyone knows the road to the next town, even if no living soul in the village has ever been further than that in their life. Local knowledge ran deep and short. Every person an expert on the 10 miles around their home, and ignorant of everything beyond it, so that you navigate the whole distance as a relay of small local certainties handed from one stranger to the next. Third, you read the land. You learn that the road keeps to the high dry ground where it can, that it makes for the church spire you can see on the next rise, because the track goes through the village and the village is at the church. That the sun rises ahead of you in the morning when you are walking east and sets behind you at evening, so that a company need only keep the morning sun in its face to know it has not turned around. And fourth, if you are a person of some means and some learning, you may carry an itinerary, not a map but a list, a written line of place names with the miles between them, this town to that town to the next. Copied out by a clerk so that you can check at each stop that you are still on the proper sequence of the highway. It is navigation as a string of beads, one place threaded after another, and it is how the whole of the medieval world found its way, not by seeing the journey whole from above, but by knowing, at each moment, only the next place along. By the middle of the morning, the freshness has worn off, and the body begins, quietly at first, to make itself known. The legs that swung so easily out of the inn yard have started to feel the weight of the pack settling into the shoulders, the rub of a seam, the first hot promise of a blister at the heel. The riders shift in their saddles. The talk grows thinner, and the host, who has done this many times and knows the rhythm of a walking day better than anyone, calls the first long halt of the morning at a likely spot, a wide verge by a stream perhaps, or the green of a village where the company can sit on the grass with their backs against a wall in the sun. This is the rest the body has been asking for, and the relief of it is enormous. The simple animal pleasure of taking the weight off the feet and the pack off the back and lying full length in the grass with your eyes shut and the warmth on your face. Out come the scrips, and out comes the food. And here is a thing worth pausing on, because the food of the road tells you a great deal about the lives these people lived. There is bread, dark and coarse and heavy, made of rye or of maslin, a mix of wheat and rye, because the fine white bread of the rich is not for travellers, and would not keep in a bag for days in any case. There is cheese, hard and salty and durable, the kind made to last through a winter and survive a week in a pack. There is ale, not water, almost always ale, because the small weak ale that everyone drank from childhood was safer than the water from a strange stream and gave a tired walker a lift besides. Perhaps there is an onion, or a heel of bacon, or a wrinkled apple kept from the autumn. It is not to feast. It is fuel, eaten with the unfussy hunger of people who have walked 8 miles and have 8 more to go. And it tastes, in the way that simple food tastes after exertion in the open air, better than anything served at a king's table. And while they eat, the company does the thing that all walkers do at the midday halt, which is to take stock to compare the state of their feet, to retie a boot, to redistribute a load that has been pulling wrong all morning, to look ahead and reckon how far to the night's lodging and whether they will make it before dark. Because beating nightfall is the whole shape of the day, and as the afternoon wears on, that is the thing that begins, gently, to press. For the medieval traveller lived by the sun in a way we have forgotten, and the great fixed terror of the road was being caught out on it after nightfall. There were no lights. When the sun went down, the dark that came was total, a blackness with no street lamp and no glow on the horizon. A night in which a route became invisible and a familiar landscape turned strange, and every sound in the hedge was a question. To be benighted, as they called it, caught out between towns with no roof in sight, was a real and present danger of losing the track, of falling, of cold, and of the men who use the night as cover. And so the whole of the afternoon's walking is shaped by a single calculation running quietly in the back of every mind. How far to shelter, and how much light is left. As the shadows lengthen and the sun slides down the sky behind them, the company's pace changes. The talk falls away. The amble tightens. There is a new purpose in the walking, a leaning forward toward the night's roof, and the host begins to look hard at the road ahead, because somewhere up there, if his reckoning is right, the first town is waiting. And then, in the last of the light, comes a thickening of the roadside cottages, a mill on a river, the smell of many fires, the sound of a church bell. The highway dips down toward a crossing of a small river. The Derwent, this is, and the town is Dartford. The first stage of the route, some 15 miles out of Southwark, and a good first day's walk by anyone's measure. And the company comes down the hill into it, as the light is failing, footsore and quiet and glad, into the welcome chaos of a market town at dusk. There are pigs in the street, and children running and shutters going up, and the day's last carts rumbling in, and there is, blessedly, the choice of a roof. For a town like Dartford on a road like this one had grown fat on travellers, and it offered the pilgrim 2 kinds of shelter, and the choice between them said a good deal about who you were and what you could pay. The first kind of roof was the inn. By the late 14th century, the inns of a tract like this had become real institutions, purpose-built to take in numbers of travellers at once, and the better ones were larger gateway wide enough to admit a cart, a courtyard within, stabling along one side for the horses, and ranges of rooms above and around. You came in off the street through the arch into the yard, and the noise and smell of it hit you at once. Horses being unsaddled and rubbed down, ostlers shouting, dogs, the steam of a kitchen, the reek of the stables, the good smell of bread and pottage somewhere underneath it. The host or his wife came out to meet a company and reckon up the terms, so much for a place by the fire and a share of the pot, so much more for a bed, more again for stabling and feed for a horse, and the haggling was brisk and expected. And then you were in, out of the dark, under a roof, and the relief of it, after a day on the road, was a thing you felt in your whole body. Step inside the common room of the inn, because this is where the evening happens, and it is the warm beating heart of the whole highway. It is a single large low room, the ceiling crossed with smoke-blackened beams, and at the centre or against one wall is the great fire. The reason everyone is here. Throwing its red light up the walls and its heat into the room and its smoke, much of it, back into the room as well. Because a chimney was a luxury, and many an inn still let its smoke find the rafters and the door as best it could. Around the fire the company gathers, and so does everyone else staying that night. Other travellers, carters, a pedlar, a pair of friars, the local men who come in for the ale, and they pull the benches close. And they steam gently as the day's wet works out of their clothes, and the pot over the fire is ladled out into the bowls they carry. A thick pottage of beans and barley and whatever greens and bones the kitchen had. And there is dark bread, and there is ale. And after a hard day in the cold air, it is, by any honest reckoning, one of the great pleasures a human body can know. The talk rises. Someone has a tale. The miller, 3 ales in, wants to sing. The fire pops and settles. For an hour or two, the road and its troubles fall away, and there is only the warmth and the food and the faces and the low roar of a room full of tired people, glad to be indoors. And then there is the bed, and here the romance of the inn falls away rather sharply, because medieval lodging was a communal and frankly verminous affair. You did not, unless you were very grand and paying very well, get a room to yourself. You got a place in a bed, and the bed was shared. 2, 3, 4 strangers. To a mattress was entirely normal and entirely unremarked. Men with men and women with women. If the house was decent, packed in for warmth as much as economy, so that you lay down to sleep beside a person you had met that afternoon and would never see again after tomorrow. The mattress was a sack of straw, restuffed when the host could be bothered, and it was almost without exception. Live fleas were universal, lice were common, bedbugs in the worst houses, and there was nothing whatever to be done about it, but accept it as the price of a roof, the way we accept traffic. People scratched and slept anyway, because a body tired enough will sleep through almost anything. There was no privacy of the kind we mean by the word. It barely existed as a concept, and there was no comfort we would recognize. But there was a roof and a wall against the wind, and the warmth of other bodies, and the knowledge that the dark and the road were shut outside the door. And for a medieval traveller, that was a great deal. That was, in fact, very nearly everything. The other kind of roof, for those who chose it, was the religious house, and it offered a different bargain. The great principle of the medieval church was hospitality. The duty, laid down in scripture and in the rule of every monastery, to receive the traveller and the pilgrim and the poor as if receiving Christ himself. And so the abbeys and priories and the special houses called hospitals, which were not hospitals in our sense, but houses of hospitality for travellers and the sick and the poor, kept guest quarters and took in pilgrims, sometimes for a fixed offering and sometimes, for the genuinely poor, for nothing at all but a prayer. To lodge a religious house was quieter and cleaner and holier than the inn, and it cost less or nothing, but it came with its own rhythm. You ate the plain fare of the house, you kept to the hours of the place, and you might be roused in the deep of the night by the bell calling the monks to their prayers, a sound that drifted through the guest quarters and reminded you even half asleep of why you had come. Some pilgrims preferred the inn for its warmth and its company and its ale. Some preferred the holy house for its peace and its cheapness, and the sense that here at least the journey's purpose was honoured. Most took whatever the town offered and were grateful. Tonight our company is at the inn, and the fire is burning down, and the host is moving among the benches saying it is time. And one by one the pilgrims climb the stair to the long room of shared beds under the eaves, and lie down in their clothes in the straw beside strangers, and pull the cloak over, and listen, for a little while, to the unfamiliar town settling around them in the dark. It is a strange thing to fall asleep in a place you have never been and will never see again, with the sounds of an unknown town coming through the shutters, a dog, a drunk man's argument 3 streets away, the watch calling the hour, the river. The watch is the town's only safety after nightfall. A man or two with a lantern and a staff walking the streets through the night hours, calling out the time and all's well, if it is. Charged with keeping the curfew and stopping the kind of trouble that the small hours breed, and his voice floating up to the sleeping pilgrims is oddly comforting. A sign that even here, in a strange place, someone is awake and watching. The curfew bell has rung, the order to cover the fires, that is what the word once meant. Cover fire, the nightly command to bank the hearths down to embers against the terror of a town burning in the dark. And the town has obeyed it and gone black, and the only lights left in all of Dartford are the watchman's lantern and the moon, if there is one. The pilgrims sleep the hard, dreamless sleep of bodies that have walked 15 miles, and the night turns over them, and far too soon, in what feels like the middle of the night, and very nearly is. The host is at the foot of the stair with a candle, because a walking day starts before the dawn. For the second great rule of the road, after staying together, was starting early. You rose in the dark while the stars were still out, because every hour of daylight was an hour of walking, and you could not afford to waste the cool grey hours of the early morning lying abed. So you woke stiff and sore in the blackness and the cold, every muscle from yesterday's road announcing itself anew, and you fumbled your boots on by the last of the embers, and you ate something fast and cold standing up. And you were out in the yard and on the track again before the sun was properly up, with the dew still on the cleared verges and the mist lying white in the river valleys and the world not yet awake. There is a particular quality to that first hour of a second day on the highway, a kind of grim, silent, shuffling solidarity, each pilgrim privately negotiating with their own aching body, no one with the breath or the will to talk. The whole company moving east into the slowly greying dawn like a procession of the half asleep. And then the sun comes up, properly up, warm on the back, and the stiffness works itself out of the legs. And the body remembers how to do this. And by the time the first hour is behind you, you have your stride again, and the day has begun in earnest. Today's road runs to Rochester, and Rochester means the Medway, and the Medway means the thing that travellers on this route both needed and feared. A river to cross, Because here is something easy to forget in a country now, stitched together with bridges, where you can cross any river in England without a thought and barely notice you have done it. In the medieval world, a river was a wall. A river was the great natural obstacle that shaped each journey and dictated the line of the tracks, and the question of how to get across one was again and again the most dangerous question a traveller faced. The Medway is a real river, wide and tidal, where the highway meets it at Rochester, far too deep and broad to wade, and a company arriving on its bank had in essence two possibilities, and one of them killed people year upon year. The good possibility was a bridge. The bad possibility, where there was no bridge, was a ford or a ferry, and we shall come to the dread of those. But Rochester, thank God, had a bridge, and the bridge at Rochester was famous, an ancient and vital crossing that had carried Watling Street over the Medway since Roman times, rebuilt and patched and fought over down the centuries, and in these very decades being raised anew in stone by the gifts of great men who knew that to build a bridge was one of the surest roads to heaven, a work of charity that served God by serving every traveller who would ever cross it. To maintain a bridge was a holy act. To let one fall was close to a sin. So the company comes down the long route to the river, and there is the bridge, and there is the price of crossing it. For a bridge cost money to build and money to keep, and that money came in part from those who used it. Levied as a toll at the bridgehead pontage, the toll for crossing a bridge. Gathered by a keeper at a little booth or a gate, a coin from every laden cart, a smaller coin from a rider, a smaller one still or nothing at all from a poor pilgrim on foot. There were tolls of other kinds threaded all along the track, and a traveller learned their names the way you learn the names of weathers. Pontage at the bridges, pavage levied by a town to mend its paved streets. Mirage to keep up the walls that kept the town safe. A market toll if you brought goods to sell. A toll at this lord's ford and that lord's gate. None of them was large. All of them together, across 60 miles, added up to a real cost, and a poor pilgrim husbanded every farthing, knowing that the road would nibble at the purse the whole way. But the toll at the bridge was a toll a wise traveller paid with something close to gratitude, because the alternative to a bridge was the thing that haunted the medieval highway. And to understand the relief of the company as they file across the firm stone of Rochester Bridge, with the brown Medway sliding beneath them, you have to understand what crossing a river meant where there was no bridge at all. Where there was no bridge, there was a ford, a place where the river ran wide and shallow enough to wade or to drive a cart through, and a ford was a thing of treachery. The depth changed with the rain and the tide. The bottom was loose stone or sucking mud or hidden holes. The current, even in water that looked calm, could take a horse's legs from under it or sweep a child off its feet, and the cold of it could stop a heart. Travellers drowned at fords. It was one of the commonest accidental deaths of the age, common enough that it barely made a story. A carter swept away with his load, a pilgrim who misjudged the depth after rain, a horse that panicked midstream and went over. And where the river was too deep even to ford, there was a ferry, a flat boat poled or rowed across, run by a ferryman who knew the water and charged what he liked. And a ferry was safer than a ford, but slow and crowded, and at the mercy of one man's skill and one man's honesty. So you can feel now why a bridge was counted a work of mercy, and why the keeper's toll was paid without much grumbling. A bridge meant you crossed dryshod, and certain. The great wall of the river simply stepped over as if it were nothing. And on the far side the road went on. The company crosses. The Medway is behind them, and rising on the far bank, grey and immense in the morning light, is Rochester. Rochester is a city, small by our reckoning, but a true city by the measure of its day, and it is the kind of place a tired company is glad to reach by mid-morning, because it offers a pause and a purpose both. Two great things stand over it, and they have stood over it for 300 years, and would have dwarfed anything the pilgrims knew from home. One is the castle, a vast square tower of pale stone on the river bank. One of the tallest and strongest keeps in all England, raised by the Normans to hold the Medway crossing and the route to London, and it looms over the bridge and the town as a plain, unanswerable statement of who holds power here. The other, just beyond it, is the cathedral, the seat of a bishop and one of the oldest in the land, and to a pilgrim it is more than a landmark. It is a stop on the holy road, a place to go in out of the daylight into the cool stone dimness, to kneel a moment, to light a candle, to rest the soul as the inn rests the body. Rochester even had a small pilgrimage of its own, a holy man whose shrine drew the devout, so that the great pilgrimage to Canterbury passed, as it were, through a lesser one on the way. The company does not stay long. Canterbury is still 2 days off, and the track will not walk itself, but they take an hour in Rochester, in the shadow of the great tower, in the cool of the cathedral, buying bread, refilling the bottles, resting the feet, before the host gathers them again, and the highway draws them on. Eastward, out of the city, and up into the rising chalk country of the Kentish Downs. And here, on the open road between the towns, with the houses behind and the next shelter half a day ahead, is the place to speak plainly about the thing that sat in the back of every traveller's mind. The thing the cleared verges and the king's peace and the safety of numbers were all arrayed against. The road was dangerous. Not at every hour, and not on every mile, and not so dangerous that people stayed home, because they plainly did not, but dangerous enough that no one walked it without a prayer and a stout staff and a strong preference for company. The chief fear was robbery, the lonely stretches of the highway, the woods that crowded the track where the verges had not been cleared or had grown back, the deep lanes and the river crossings where a company had to slow and string out. These were the places where men who lived outside the law waited for the careless and the unlucky. Some were desperate poor men turned to the highway by hunger. Some were organized bands sworn together who terrorized whole districts and were half the reason the king's roads needed the king's protection at all. They took purses, packs, horses, cloaks, the very boots off a traveller's feet, and they were not gentle about it, and a pilgrim who resisted might be left bleeding in a ditch for the sake of a few coins and a wheel of cheese. The law fought back in its fashion, but the law in the open country was a thin and distant thing. The cleared verges we have already walked beside were one weapon. Take away the robber's cover, and you take away half his trade. The hue and cry was another. The rule that every man within earshot of a crime must drop what he was doing and join the chase, so that a cry of alarm could raise a whole countryside against a fleeing thief. There were officers of the peace, and there were courts, and there were grim public punishments meant to frighten the rest. But between the towns, on the road itself, a traveller was largely on their own, and they knew it, and it shaped how they moved, closing up at the dangerous places, hurrying past the dark woods, never travelling after dark if it could be helped, keeping the staff to hand, and robbery was not the only danger. There was illness, the fever or the flux that could take a traveller far from home, with no physician nearer than the next monastery, and no medicine but rest and prayer. There was injury, the turned ankle on a hidden stone, the fall from a horse, the cut that festered small things at home, but on the route, miles from any care, capable of ending a journey or worse. The track, for all its company and its faith and its singing, was a place where the ordinary protections of life fell away, and people knew it and went anyway. That in the end is the measure of how much it meant to them to reach the shrine. They were willing to risk a great deal to get there, which is why the road's network of charity mattered so enormously. And why the next thing I want to show you is one of the most quietly moving institutions of the whole medieval world. As the second day's road runs on through the afternoon, and the company comes down at last, footsore and emptied, toward the next night's lodging, a stop called Ospringe, well along the highway toward Canterbury now, there stands a house that was built for no other reason than to take in people exactly like them. It was called a Maison Dieu, a house of God, and it was a hospital in the old and truer sense of the word, not a place to cure the sick, but a house of hospitality, founded and endowed by the gifts of the pious, to shelter travellers, to feed the hungry pilgrim, to nurse the sick one, to give a bed to the poor one who had no coin for any inn. It was run by a small community under religious vows, and it lived out, day after day, the hard and beautiful idea at the centre of the whole pilgrimage culture, that the stranger at your door might be Christ, and that to feed and shelter a traveller in his name was to lay up treasure in heaven. A poor pilgrim who could pay nothing could find here a bowl of pottage and a clean pallet and someone to look at his ruined feet. Ask for nothing in return but a prayer. A sick pilgrim could lie here and be tended until he mended or died, and either way be cared for. It is easy, looking back across 600 years, to see the medieval world as a cruel and frightening place, and in many ways it was, but it built these houses, all along its roads, in their hundreds, out of the conviction that the traveller had a claim on the kindness of strangers. And that conviction is one of the loveliest things it left behind. The company sleeps at Ospringe, in the Maison Dieu and the inn beside it, and as they settle for the third night, it is worth sitting for a while with the question that has been walking beside us the whole way. The question of why. Why do it at all? Why leave the safety of home? Spend money you can ill afford, risk the robbers and the rivers and the fever, and walk for days on ruined feet to kneel in front of the bones of a man dead 200 years. The modern mind reaches for explanations, a holiday, an adventure, a break from the grind of the fields. And there is truth in all of those, because a pilgrimage was, among much else, the one long journey an ordinary person might ever make. The one time a ploughman saw a city or a great cathedral or the sea, the medieval equivalent of the only travel a whole life would contain. But to leave it there would be to miss the heart of it entirely. Because for the people in our company, the journey was, first and last, and all the way through, a matter of the soul. To understand it, you have to step inside a way of seeing the world that we have largely lost. For these people, the unseen was as real as the road, more real, the truest fact there was. Heaven and hell were not metaphors, but places, as solid as Canterbury and a great deal more permanent. And the whole of this brief life was a test whose result was an eternity of bliss or an eternity of torment, with most souls bound, the Church taught, for a long, hard cleansing in between in the fire of purgatory before they could be made fit for heaven. Sin was a debt, and the debt had to be paid here or hereafter, and the terror of the unpaid debt, the years and ages of purging fire that awaited even the forgiven, sat at the back of every devout medieval life, and the pilgrimage was one of the great ways the age had devised to pay it down. To go on pilgrimage was an act of penance, a hard thing willingly suffered to make amends for sin, and the harder the road, the more it was worth. A confessor might lay a pilgrimage on a penitent as the price of absolution for some grave fault. The church might attach to a great shrine an indulgence, a remission of a measured portion of that purging fire, granted to those who came in true penitence and prayed there. So the man with the heavy sin walks to Canterbury, because his confessor has told him it is the route out from under it. The widow walks because she vowed it, and a vow to God is not a thing you break. They are not tourists, they are debtors, walking to settle accounts that will otherwise be settled in fire. But penance was only one face of it, and not, for most, the warmest. The other face was hope, for the saint at the end of the track was not only a judge to be appeased, but a friend to be asked, a powerful patron in the court of heaven who could be petitioned, and Thomas of Canterbury had a reputation, built over 2 centuries, and tens of thousands of recorded cases, as a saint who answered. The sick came to be healed, and carried home the stories of those who had been, the blind who saw, the lame who walked, the dying who rose, written up by the monks and painted into the great windows of the cathedral for every pilgrim to see. The barren wife came to ask for a child. The merchant prayed for safe ships and good trade. The frightened sought courage, the grieving comfort, the guilty peace. They arrived carrying their griefs and their fears and their unspeakable private hopes the whole length of the road, the way our young wife carries hers. And they held the deep conviction that there was a place where those things could be laid down, and a person on the other side of death who would take them up. That is what the highway was. It was the long walk toward laying down a burden. And whatever you or I may believe about what waited at the end of it, there is something in the willingness to walk 60 miles on the strength of a hope. That is among the most human of all our impulses. So they sleep on the 3rd night with the shrine one day off, and the hope and the dread of it growing in them. And in the morning they rise in the dark and walk out for the last full day of the route. And this is the day to talk about the weather, because the weather was the great unwritten companion of every journey. The force that could turn the same 60 miles from a pleasant spring ramble into a slow ordeal of mud and misery, and a company never knew, setting out, which track the sky would give them. We have walked our company through a kind spring-dry verges, warm sun on the back, the chalk walking hard and clean, and that was a mercy, because the road in springtime, were the orchards of Kent in blossom, and the hedges greening, and the larks up over the cleared fields, was as fine a thing as the medieval world offered. And the pilgrims who got that highway counted themselves blessed and said so. But the route did not always give it. Come at the same way in autumn, after the rains have set in, and it is another world. The clay of the low ground turns to a deep churned mire that pulls the shoe from the foot and the strength from the leg. Every step a small fight. The miles slowing to a crawl. The rivers rise. A ford that was knee-deep in summer runs chest-high and brown and fast, and a crossing that was nothing becomes a thing that drowns the unlucky. And a company may sit a whole day on the wrong bank of a flooded stream, waiting for the water to fall. The rain finds every gap in the cloak, and runs down the neck, and soaks the bread in the scrip, and never, it seems, quite stops. And a pilgrim walks all day, wet to the skin, and lies down wet at night, and rises wet in the morning. And the cold of it works into the bones, in a way that a modern person, who has never been more than minutes from a dry roof, can scarcely imagine. Come in the deep of winter, and the road is harder still, the days short and the dark long, the cold a killing thing, the inns crowded and the food dear, and only the most determined or the most desperate took the track at all. Come in high summer, and the danger flips around. Now it is dust instead of mud. A fine choking white dust kicked up by every cart, and the heat, and the flies, and the thirst, and the rivers low and warm and foul. The pilgrims read the sky the way a sailor reads it, knowing their whole comfort and half their safety hung on it. And they thanked God for a dry day and endured a wet one, and told each other, as walkers always have, that it would surely clear by afternoon. Tonight, for us, it holds fair. But hold in your mind, as we go, all the other companies, on all the other highways, in all the other weathers, soaked and frozen and footsore, walking the same miles toward the same shrine, because that, far more than our kind spring evening, was the truth of it for most. For by the third day, fair weather or foul, the body has become the central fact of the journey, and there is no use pretending otherwise. The feet are the worst of it. 60 miles of walking on hard ground in soft leather shoes, with no support to speak of, had punished feet that were already, in the way of medieval feet, far from pampered. And by the third day, the blisters of the first day have burst and healed and been replaced by new ones. The soles ache with a deep bruised ache that the morning's first steps reawaken every dawn. And a pilgrim learns to walk through pain the way you learn to walk through anything, by ceasing, after a while, to fight it. The legs are leaden in the mornings and loose by midday. The shoulders carry the permanent groove of the strap. There is a tiredness that is not the tiredness of a single hard day, but the deep accumulated tiredness of days laid one on another, with no real rest between. A tiredness that sleep takes the edge from, but does not lift. And yet, and this is the strange thing that walkers know, and that the pilgrims wrote of, something else comes with it. As the body wears down, something in the mind clears and lightens. The endless small worries of ordinary life, which cannot survive 60 miles of road, fall away one by one until there is nothing left but the next step, and the company beside you, and the shrine ahead. And into that emptied space comes a kind of peace, a simplicity that the pilgrims understood to be part of the gift of the journey. You are reduced, by the route, to something very plain and very calm, and it is in exactly that state, emptied, aching, simplified, lightened, that the medieval pilgrim came on the last morning over the hills toward the holy city. Which is, I think, no accident at all. The track broke them down on purpose, and what was left, when it had done its work, was ready on this last morning, as the highway climbs into the chalk hills that screen the city. The talk in the company turns, more than it has the whole way, to the man they are walking toward, and it is right that we should turn to him too. Because by now you may be wondering what a single murdered archbishop could possibly have done to set 60 miles of road humming with traffic for 300 years. So let me tell you about Thomas Becket, as the pilgrims tell it to one another on the last morning, in the version that had become, by their day, something between history and legend, and was the truer for being both. He was, they say, a Londoner, a merchant's son, clever and charming and ambitious, who rose by his wits into the household of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and then into the service of the young king, Henry, the second of that name, and became the king's right hand and his closest friend. The two of them were inseparable, the king and his chancellor, hunting and feasting and ruling together, and Thomas in those years was a man of the world, splendid and worldly and proud. And then the old archbishop died, and the king, wanting his own man at the head of the English church, made his friend Thomas the Archbishop of Canterbury, expecting him to serve the crown's interests as he always had. But something happened to Thomas when he took up that office. The worldly chancellor became, almost overnight, a rigorous and unbending churchman, who put the rights of the church above the will of the king, and the friendship curdled into the bitterest of quarrels over law, over power, over whose word ran in England, the king's or the pope's. Thomas fled abroad into exile for years. He returned home at last to an uneasy truce, and then, that December, the king in a far-off castle, sick with rage at his old friend's defiance, said the words that men have argued over ever since, something to the effect of, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" And 4 of his knights took him at his word, and rode for the coast, and crossed to England, and rode for Canterbury. What happened there, in the cathedral, on the dark winter evening of the 29th of December, is the still centre of the whole pilgrimage, the thing the road exists to lead to, and the pilgrims tell it in hushed voices because they will, in a few hours, be standing on the very stones. The knights came in their armour, looking for him. The monks, terrified, tried to bar the doors and to hurry the archbishop away to safety, into the cathedral, where surely even these men would not dare. He would not be hurried. He would not let the doors be barred. He went into his own cathedral as the office of Vespers was being sung, and the knights followed him in out of the dark with their swords drawn, shouting for the traitor. And there, in the north transept, in the candlelight, before the horrified monks, they cut him down. It was not a clean killing. They struck him to his knees, and then struck again, and a blow took the crown clean off his head, and one of them set his sword point to the wound, and scattered what was within across the stone floor. And it was done. And the knights fled out into the night, and the murdered archbishop lay in his own blood, in his own church, while the monks crept back in horror to gather what was left of him. And then the strange thing began, the thing that made the road. Almost at once, before the body was cold, the people of Canterbury understood that something tremendous had happened in their midst, that a holy man had been martyred at the altar by the agents of a king, and they began to come. They dipped cloths in the blood on the floor. They begged scraps of his clothing. And the sick among them who touched these things began, the stories said, to be healed, and the stories multiplied, and travelled and grew, the blind and the lame and the dying, until within a very few years, Thomas the murdered archbishop had become Saint Thomas the Martyr, declared so by the Pope, his tomb a place of pilgrimage, his name known across all Christendom. The king himself, his old friend and the cause of his death, came at last to Canterbury in penance, and walked the final stretch barefoot, and knelt at the tomb, and let the monks scourge him with rods for what his words had brought about. The most powerful man in England, beaten at the tomb of the friend he had destroyed, and from that day the shrine of St. Thomas was the greatest in the land. And the road our company walks was beaten ever deeper by the feet of those who came to seek what the man's death had loosed into the world. That is who waits at the end of the route. A friend betrayed, a saint made by murder, a healer of the broken. No wonder they walk in silence on the last morning. No wonder the young wife holds her hope a little tighter. And the air of the last miles is thick with the stories of what the saint had done, because every company carried them and traded them and added to them. And they are the reason. The hope in the pilgrims' chests is not a vague thing, but a sharp and particular expectation. They have heard of the knight thrown from his horse and given up for dead, who rose whole at the saint's name, of the child drowned in a well and carried lifeless to the tomb and restored to its mother's arms, of the mad soothed, the fevered cooled, the wounds that closed. Other ships saved from the storm by a vow made in the last moment to St. Thomas of Canterbury. These were not idle tales to them. They were sworn cases, recorded by the monks who kept the registers of the shrine, examined and attested and believed, and the greatest of them had been set, glowing, into the tall windows of the cathedral itself, so that a pilgrim arriving could walk along beneath them and read in coloured glass the long roll of mercies the saint had worked, picture after picture of the sick brought low, and the saint's power lifting them up. The visual proof, lit by the sun, that this was a place where the impossible had happened and might happen again to you. And there was the water, for the monks of Canterbury gave the pilgrims water of St. Thomas, water in which the merest trace of the martyr's blood was said to be mingled, diluted down through the years into something a pilgrim could carry home in a little flask of lead or tin and drink or touch to a sick child's lips. A portable piece of the shrine's power for those who could not stay or could not bring the suffering one all this way. To carry home a flask of the water of St. Thomas was to carry home hope itself, sealed in metal, and every pilgrim in our company means to have one. The last miles of the road run through a stretch of woodland, the kind of dense old forest that crowded the highway in places, and that travellers were always glad to be through. And then the country opens again into the gentle farmed land of the final approach. The company passes through a village called Bourton, under the wooded hill they call the Blean, and the pilgrims know now that they are close, that this is the last village but one, and a kind of impatience runs through them, that the whole 60 miles has not produced before. They walk faster, the aches forgotten, the talk dying away into a held breath, because somewhere just ahead, beyond one more rise, is the thing they have walked 4 days to reach. And then comes the last village before the city, and it is a place every Canterbury pilgrim knew, and many of them dreaded a little, and all of them gave to, and it is called Harbledown. 4. At Harbledown. Set just back from the road on the final hill, before the descent into Canterbury, there stood a hospital of a different and harder kind than the Maison Dieu at Ospringe Leper House. A community of the most feared and pitied sufferers of the medieval world, set apart here on the very threshold of the Holy City. Leprosy was the great horror of the age, a slow disfiguring disease that the law and the church required its victims to be separated from the living world, declared dead to ordinary society in a grim ceremony, and shut away in houses like this one, dependent on charity for everything, forbidden the company of the whole. And yet they were not without their place, because the medieval mind held the leper to be, in a terrible way, blessed suffering in this life, the purging that other souls would suffer in the next, walking already half in the other world, and so closer, perhaps, to God than the healthy who recoiled from them. The lepers of Harbledown came out, as pilgrims passed, to beg the alms that kept them alive, and they offered something in return that was worth the giving of a coin, and more for the hospital kept a relic, a fragment said to come from the very shoe of St. Thomas himself, and the pilgrim who gave alms was allowed to kiss it. Here, at the last station before the city, a final touch of the saint's holiness before they ever reached his shrine. So the company stops at Harbledown, and gives, and one by one bends, to kiss the worn relic held out to them by hands they would shrink from in any other place. And in that moment, the healthy pilgrim and the dying leper meeting over the relic of the saint, there is something that gathers up all the strange tenderness of the medieval faith, the conviction that the broken and the cast out stood near the front of God's attention, and that to touch them in charity was to touch holiness itself. They give, and they kiss the relic, and they walk on, up the last of the hill. And here it is. Here at the brow of the hill above Harbledown, after 4 days and 60 miles, after the mud and the rivers and the robbers feared, and the feet ruined, and the nights in the straw beside strangers, the road tops the rise. And the valley of the little river Stour opens out below, and there across the green distance, rising sheer and pale and immense out of the huddled roofs of the city. Far bigger than anything most of these people have ever seen, or will ever see again, are the towers of the Cathedral of Canterbury. The whole company stops. It stops as if a hand had been laid on it. And the thing I promised you at the very beginning, back in the dark inn-yard at Southwark, the thing I said I would not yet explain, it happens now. Men and women who have walked the whole way dry-eyed, who have endured the rain and the blisters and the fear without a word of complaint, stand at the top of that hill and look across the valley at the towers of the cathedral, and they weep. They weep openly, strangers and all, the hard miller and the proud merchant and the quiet widow, the tears running down faces worn thin by the road. And there is no shame in it, because every one of them is doing it together. The place even had a name for it. They called this the Mountjoy, the Hill of Joy, the place where the goal first comes into sight. And the joy that broke over a pilgrim company here was a thing written about again and again, because it was real, and because nothing in our smooth and instant world quite prepares us to understand it. So let me try to give it to you, the why of those tears, because it is the heart of everything we have walked toward. Imagine wanting something with your whole soul, healing for a sick child, peace for an unbearable guilt. A sign that the husband you buried did not simply vanish into nothing. Wanting it so much that you left your home and your work and walked 4 days through danger and pain on the strength of the belief that at the end of the road there was a place where that longing could be laid down. Ants. Imagine the whole of that hope compressed into the length of a journey, growing with every mile until your entire self is bent toward a single point 60 miles away. And then imagine cresting a hill and seeing it. The towers, the actual towers. No longer a word or a hope, but a thing standing solid against the sky. Near enough now that you will kneel at the shrine before the sun goes down. The relief of it, the disbelief that you have truly come so far and truly arrived. The sudden, unbearable nearness of the thing you have carried all this way. Of course they wept. They wept because the longing and the arrival met in a single instant on that hilltop. And the human heart, when those two things meet, can do nothing else. And then, wiping their faces, half laughing at themselves and at one another, the company starts down the last hill toward the city, and the towers grow, and the road fills with other pilgrims doing the same, and the bells of Canterbury, if it is the right hour, come faint and golden across the valley to meet them. The descent into Canterbury is a coming down in every sense, from the high empty track into the close and crowded life of a city given over, almost wholly, to the saint at its heart. For Canterbury, by the late 14th century, was a pilgrimage city, the way some cities are harbour cities or market cities, its whole economy, its whole character, shaped and fed by the unending river of pilgrims that flowed into it along the highway we have walked, and the other routes that converged on it from the coast and the country round. The highway runs in past the suburbs and the gardens, the houses of the well-to-do who like to live a little out, and then it reaches the city wall and the great gate, and the company passes under the arch into the streets, and the change is total. After 4 days of open road and bird song and the company's own voices, the city is a wall of noise and press and smell, the streets narrow and packed, the overhanging houses nearly meeting overhead, Unacquainted the way crowded with pilgrims and townsfolk and carts and beggars and friars, and the constant traffic of a place where thousands of strangers arrived and departed every week of the year. And the trade? The city had grown rich on the pilgrims and made no secret of it. And the streets near the cathedral were lined with those who lived by selling to the devout. There were sellers of badges and tokens, the little stamped emblems of lead and tin that a pilgrim bought as proof of the journey and pinned to the hat for the road home and the rest of a life. There were sellers of the small flasks for the water of St. Thomas, of candles to burn at the shrine, of images and trinkets and rosaries, of food and ale for the hungry traveller, of beds for the night. The pilgrim arriving was, the moment they passed the gate, a customer, and the city knew it. And there is something bracingly honest about the way the medieval pilgrimage mingled the holy and the commercial without the least embarrassment. The soul's journey and the seller's cry side by side in the same crowded street as they always had been, as perhaps they always are. The company threads through it, gawping like the country folk most of them are, clutching their purses against the press, swept along toward the centre, toward the cathedral precinct and the great church rising over the rooftops, nearer with every street, until they come out at last into the open space before the gate of the precinct, and there it is, full and entire and overwhelming. The Cathedral of Canterbury filling the sky. But it is late in the day now, and the shrine is not a thing to be rushed at the end of a road, tired and travel-stained and unprepared, and most pilgrims did not. They found their lodging first, and finding it could be hard, in a city so often full to bursting, the inns crowded and the prices high, and the latecomers sometimes sleeping 4 and 5 to a bed, or on the floor of the common room, or, if the worst came, in the open. They washed off the road as best they could, because you did not come before the saint filthy from the journey if you could help it. They ate and rested the ruined feet, and lay down that last night in Canterbury with the cathedral bells close at hand, now ringing the offices through the dark, no longer faint across a valley, but near and huge and just there. On the other side of a few streets, the sound of the place they had walked 4 days to reach, washing over them as they slept their last night on the road. And in the morning, washed and fed, and as ready as a person can be made, they would go in. The company sleeps. The bells ring midnight, and then the small hours, and the city quiets around its great church, and the pilgrims lie in the dark a few streets from the end of everything they have walked toward. And some of them cannot sleep at all, for the nearness of it. And then it is morning, and the company rises and dresses with a care it had not taken in days, and walks the last few streets through the early crowd to the precinct gate, and passes through into the great open green before the cathedral. And there is nothing now between them and the saint but the doors of the church and the floor they will cross on their knees. Stand with them a moment in the precinct, in the long shadow of the cathedral, and look up at it, the way they are looking up at it. It is the largest made thing they have ever stood beneath. A cliff of pale stone soaring into towers, carved and pinnacled and immense, built and rebuilt across the centuries by the wealth the saint himself had drawn here. A building whose whole purpose was to be too large and too beautiful for the human scale, to stop the breath and bow the head and say, before a single word was spoken, that the thing housed within was worth all of this and more. The pilgrims who came from villages of wattle and thatch, who had never in their lives stood inside a space they could not touch the roof of, were meant to feel small here, and they did, and the feeling was the point. To be made small was to be made ready, to be reminded of the smallness of the self before the vastness of God and the holiness of the martyr. They crossed the green, They come to the great doors. They go inside. The world changes again, and this time utterly. The noise of the city is cut off behind the closing of the doors, and the company stands at the foot of a long stone river of a nave, its roof lost in shadow far overhead, its pillars marching away into a dimness lit only by the coloured fall of light through the high windows and the small steady flames of candles burning in their hundreds before the altars and the images. The air is cold with the cold of old stone that never sees the sun, and thick with the smell of beeswax and tallow and incense, and the press of many bodies, and full always of sound, the murmur of prayer. The shuffle of feet on stone, worn smooth by feet, and rising over it all, from somewhere out of sight beyond the screen, the slow rise and fall of monks singing the office. The plain chant that filled this church through every hour of the day and night, a sound with no edges that seemed less to be made than simply to be present, like the cold or the candlelight. A pilgrim coming in off the road from a village church, the size of a barn, was undone by it. There was nothing in their experience to measure it against. Heaven, if it had a sound and a smell and a quality of light, must be something like this, and that was exactly what the builders had meant, a soul to feel. Standing here for the first time, with the root still in its legs. The shrine of St. Thomas was not in the nave, but far ahead and high up, raised at the eastern end of the church behind the high altar, and a pilgrim did not simply walk to it. There was a way to be followed, a route the great church laid out for the pilgrim soul, leading from station to holy station, each one a deepening, so that by the time you reached the shrine itself, you had been led step by step through the whole story of the saint and made ready for the heart of it. And the first station, the spot every pilgrim went to first, was not the shrine at all. It was the place of the murder. For there, in the north transept, on the very spot where the 4 knights had cut Thomas down on that December evening, 2 centuries before, the cathedral had made holy ground of the killing itself, the martyrdom, they called it. And a pilgrim was brought here first of all, to stand on the stones where the blood had run, to look at the spot where it had happened. There was an altar there now, and the broken point of a sword was shown, said to be from the very weapon, and the pilgrims crowded into the transept and stood where the monks had stood in their terror and looked at the floor. And the guide among them, a monk or a verger, told the story again in that very place, in a low voice, of how he had come in as vespers was sung, and would not let the doors be barred, and was struck down, here, just here, where you are standing. And the pilgrims, who had heard the story 100 times, and told it to one another the whole length of the road, heard it now standing on the stone where it had happened, and it was a different thing entirely. This was where it was real. This was where a man had died for refusing his king. Here, under their feet. And from this stone the vast church and the long track and their own 4 days of walking had flowed. Some of them knelt on the spot and could not, for a while, get up. From the martyrdom, the way led down, into the earth, into the crypt beneath the choir. And this was the second station, and the oldest and the darkest, and to many the most moving of all. For the crypt was where the murdered archbishop had first been buried, in the hours after his death, hidden away by the frightened monks in the lowest and safest part of their church. And it was here, at that first plain tomb, that the earliest miracles had happened, before there was any shrine of gold or any great traffic of pilgrims. Here, in the dark under the church, that the sick had first crept to touch the stone and gone away healed, and it had all begun. The crypt was a forest of squat round pillars, holding up the weight of the church above, low and close and cold, lit by the small flames of the candles the pilgrims bought and left burning, the dark pressing in beyond the candlelight. And there was about it a quality the soaring nave above did not have, an intimacy, a nearness, the sense of being close to the buried heart of the matter. Pilgrims lingered in the crypt. They knelt at the place of the first tomb. They lit their candles and watched them join the others. And in that low, cold dark, with the weight of the great church overhead, and the small lights burning, and the chant drifting faintly down from above, more than one pilgrim found the thing they had carried 60 miles beginning, at last, to come loose in them. The tears starting that would not fully come until they reached the top. And then, at last, the way leads up. Up out of the crypt and back into the light, and then up again. By a broad flight of stone steps toward the eastern end of the church, where the shrine itself stood high above the floor of the choir, raised up so that all might see it, in its own great chapel full of light. These were the pilgrim steps, and they were worn into deep hollows in the solid stone by the knees of the faithful, because a pilgrim of true devotion did not walk up to the shrine of St. Thomas, but climbed the last steps on their knees, one by one, in humility. And the stone itself recorded their passing in the smooth, scooped dishes that centuries of knees had pressed into it. As the company climbs on their knees or on their feet, the windows rise around them, the great tall windows of the Trinity Chapel filled with coloured glass, and these are the famous windows of the miracles. The long pictured roll of everything the saint had done, and the climbing pilgrim, raising their eyes, sees them lit by the morning sun. Panel after glowing panel, the sick on their beds, and the saint appearing to them, and the sick risen up and walking. The whole shining catalogue of mercy hung in the air above the shrine like a promise. You climb toward the saint with the proof of his power burning in glass on every side. And ahead, growing as you climb, is the thing itself. But know, before the gold blazes, that you do not come to it alone. This is the thing the quiet of an empty modern cathedral can never tell you. That in its day the shrine of St. Thomas was rarely still and almost never solitary, because Canterbury at the height of its fame was the busiest holy place in the kingdom. And the pilgrim who climbed the worn steps did so as one in a press, of others all climbing the same steps with the same hunger, all the long day, every day, year upon year. There were crowds on the great feast days of the saint. There were enormous crowds, the whole precinct thronged, the church packed to its pillars, the pilgrims flowing through in their hundreds and their thousands. And even on an ordinary day, a company arriving found others ahead of them and others behind, a slow, steady river of the devout that the monks of the cathedral had long since learned to manage and to channel. For this was a practiced operation, polished by 2 centuries of practice. The monks who tended the shrine knew exactly how to move the multitude through, from station to station. The place of the murder and the crypt and the steps and the shrine and the crown, keeping the river flowing, watching the offerings, drawing the cover up at the appointed times, so that wave after wave of pilgrims might see the gold revealed. Performing the whole sacred machinery of the greatest pilgrimage in England, with the smooth competence of men who did it in their sleep. And so the pilgrim's great moment, the moment walked 60 miles to reach, was had in a crush, shoulder to shoulder with strangers, jostled and pressed, the air thick with the breath and the smell and the murmured prayers of 100 others. Children crying somewhere, the sick groaning, the sound of weeping, and the sound of coins falling into boxes, and the endless shuffle of feet on stone. You might think that would spoil it, the crowd, the noise, the sheer traffic busyness of the holy place, and to a modern sensibility that prizes solitude and silence it might. But to the pilgrim, it was the opposite of spoiling. To kneel at the shrine in the press of the multitude was to feel yourself joined to something vast, to all the others kneeling around you now. The whole cross-section of the living come with their burdens to the same place. And beyond them, to all the others who had knelt here across the centuries and worn the steps to hollows with their knees. And beyond them, to the great communion of the faithful living and dead, of which the Church taught you were a part. You were not a lone soul whispering into an empty echo. You were one voice in a chorus that had never once fallen silent in 200 years, and never would, or so they believed. A single drop in a river of longing that flowed and flowed toward the saint without ceasing. There was comfort in that, deep comfort, the comfort of company in the one place where a person is most apt to feel alone, before God with the worst of themselves laid bare. The widow and the penitent and the barren wife laid down their burdens, not in solitude, but in a crowd of strangers, all laying down their own. And somehow that made it easier and not harder. The privacy of the prayer held safe inside the press of the public throng. So feel the crowd around you as you climb. Feel yourself one of many. And now, with the multitude pressed close on every side, and the murmur rising, and the monks moving to the ropes, the cover begins to lift. I have to try now to make you see the shrine, because there is nothing in the ordinary world to compare it to. And the pilgrims who saw it spoke of it for the rest of their lives. It stood high on a base of stone, and over the saint's bones rose a great chest, and that chest was covered, every visible inch of it, in gold. Gold plate worked and figured, and set into the gold, thick as stars, were jewels beyond counting, the offerings of 2 centuries of kings and queens and nobles, and the merely rich, who had given their finest stones to adorn the resting place of the martyr. There were sapphires and emeralds and rubies and pearls, rings and brooches and clasps fixed to the gold, and among them the most famous single jewel in all of England, a great ruby, the size of a man's thumbnail, the gift of a king of France that seemed to burn with its own inner fire and that pilgrims pointed out to one another in awe. And the whole of it, the gold, the jewels, the great ruby, was kept hidden, most of the time beneath a wooden cover, a painted canopy that hung over the shrine on ropes. The pilgrims gathered before it and waited and prayed, and then, at the appointed moment, a monk drew on the ropes and the cover rose, slowly, with a clatter of little silver bells hung upon it to announce the unveiling. And the shrine of St. Thomas was revealed in a single blaze of gold and fire, the candlelight and the coloured sun catching every jewel at once, so that the whole shrine seemed to flash and burn before their eyes. The pilgrims, packed close in the chapel, fell to their knees as one. Some cried out, some wept, some simply stared, struck dumb at the most dazzling sight they would ever in their lives behold. After 60 miles of mud, this, after the straw and the fleas and the ruined feet, and the cold and the fear, this, a wall of gold and fire, the resting place of the saint, blazing in the light. And here, at the foot of the blazing shrine, on their knees on the worn stone, the pilgrims at last do what they have walked 4 days to do. They lay it down, they open their hands, and they pour out, in silence, or in whispered words, or in tears that need no words at all, the burden they have carried the whole long way. And now I want you to think of the company we have walked beside, because this is the moment they came for. The widow, who vowed at her husband's deathbed to make this journey, kneels and keeps her vow and tells him, somehow, that it is done. The man with the heavy sin kneels and lays the whole black weight of it down before the saint and asks, with everything in him, to be allowed to walk away from this place lighter than he came to it. The merchant prays for his ships and is for once in his calculating life, not calculating anything at all. The priest, who has wanted this since he was a boy, kneels at the shrine of the greatest saint of his country with his whole heart full and overflowing. And the young wife, who has carried a hope the entire way and told it to no one, not even the husband kneeling beside her, she kneels before the saint who is said to give children to the barren. And she lays her hope at his feet, and she asks, whatever they carried, they lay it here. That is what the shrine was for. Not the gold, and not the jewels, and not even the bones, in the end. But this. A place at the far end of a hard road where a human being could kneel and finally set down the thing too heavy to carry alone and believe with their whole soul that it had been received. And whether you share that belief or not, I think there is no one alive who does not understand the need for such a place. We have all of us carried something we did not know how to set down. They walked 60 miles to a chest of gold to set it down, and they rose from their knees, many of them lighter. That is not a small thing. That may be the largest thing there is. There was one station more, beyond even the shrine, at the very furthest eastern end of the church, in a round chapel that caught the first of the morning light, and it held the strangest and most intimate relic of all. They called it the corona, the crown, because it housed the piece of the saint that the sword had taken, the severed crown of his head, the very part struck off in the murder, kept now in a reliquary of gold and shown to the pilgrims who came this far. To stand in the corona was to come as close to the physical fact of the martyrdom as the living could come, closer in its way than the blazing shrine, because here was not gold and jewels, but the man himself, the actual bone, the actual wound. And there were other relics shown along the pilgrims' round, brought out by the monks to be venerated, fragments of cloth and bone and the things the saint had touched, each one a point where the holy broke through into the ordinary world and could be knelt before and sometimes kissed. The pilgrims made their offering at each station, a coin laid down, a candle lit. And the offerings of 2 centuries had made Canterbury one of the richest churches in Christendom. The gold of the shrine and the jewels upon it, only the visible top of a treasury fed daily by the pennies of the poor and the gifts of the great. There is a hard truth folded into that, which the pilgrims half saw and mostly did not mind, that their faith was also the city's industry, that the tears on the hill and the coins in the box were not 2 separate things, but one, and that the saint who healed the sick also clothed the monks and paved the streets and raised the towers. They did not, on the whole, find this troubling. The holy and the worldly had always lived in the same house. The miracle was no less a miracle for costing a penny to approach. And before they left, every pilgrim secured the thing they would carry home, the proof and the portion of the journey, and there were 2 of these above all. The first was the water of St. Thomas, the holy water tinged with the memory of the martyr's blood, sold to the pilgrims in little flasks of lead and tin-shaped for the purpose, with the saint's image stamped upon them and a loop to hang them round the neck. To carry home a flask of the water was to carry home a piece of the shrine's power itself, to be drunk in sickness or touched to the lips of a suffering child far away, who could never make the journey. And the roads out of Canterbury were dotted with pilgrims wearing these little flasks at their breasts like the most precious thing they owned, which to them it very nearly was. The second was the badge, the pilgrim sign, the stamped emblem of pewter that said to anyone who saw it for the rest of the wearer's life, "I have been to Canterbury. I have knelt at the shrine of St. Thomas. I made the journey and I came home." The Canterbury badges took many forms across the years. The saint on his horse, the saint's head, the sword that killed him, the bell of the shrine, and a pilgrim chose one and pinned it to the hat beside the badges of any other shrines they had reached, and wore it home and wore it after, and was buried with it, sometimes, when the time came. To us, a cheap pewter pin. To them, the visible mark of the greatest deed of their lives, the token of a debt paid, or a hope laid down, or a soul, for a while at least, set at peace. They buy their water and they pin their badges, and it is accomplished. The road has reached its end. What is hard to convey, from the far side of 600 years, is what these people took away from that morning that could not be pinned to a hat or hung round a neck, the inward part, the change. Because they did not come away unchanged, most of them. They had walked 4 days through danger and pain toward a single point, and they had reached it, and they had knelt at it and laid down what they carried. And an ordeal like that does not leave a person where it found them. There was the plain satisfaction of having done a hard thing and finished it. There was the lightness of the burden set down, real for those who felt it. The guilt absolved, the vow kept, the hope entrusted. And there was what the highway itself had given them, quite apart from the shrine, the bond of the company, the strangers who had become over 60 miles of shared rain and shared bread and shared fear. Something they had no exact word for, but that we might call simply friends. They had been for 4 days equal in a world that was never otherwise equal, and they had been kind to one another and carried one another. And that too was a kind of holiness, and they knew it and would remember it. The Duchess and the dyer would go back to their separate worlds and never speak again. But for 4 days the road had shown them that the walls between them were not as fixed as they had always seemed, and a glimpse like that, once had, is not entirely lost. They came for the saint. They got the saint, and the route threw in the company for nothing. That last evening in Canterbury, with the shrine behind them and the journey accomplished, the company gathered one more time, and it was unlike any of the evenings on the track. The strain was gone out of it. There was no early start to dread, no miles still to count, no weather to fear in the morning. Nothing now but the warmth of the inn and the food and one another, and a great loosening came over them all. They ate well that night, better than they had the whole way, because a journey's end is a thing to be marked, and because they had a little money left now that the shrine had been reached, and there was no longer any reason to hoard it against the road. They told the story of their own journey back to one another, already, even before it was a day old. The ford that nearly took the miller, the night the merchant's wife would not stop complaining of the bed, the moment on the hill when they had all of them wept and then laughed at one another for weeping. It was becoming, as it was lived, a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. And they were telling it together for the first and the last time, because they knew, without quite saying it, that after tomorrow they would never all be in one room again. There is a particular sweetness to an evening like that, the sweetness of a thing that is wholly good and wholly ending at the same moment, and the company felt it, and lingered late by the fire, and were slow, that last night, to climb the stair to bed, for in the morning they would part, and the parting of a pilgrim company was a real grief, small beside the griefs they had each carried to the shrine, but real all the same. Some of them were not going home at all, not yet, A few would go on, eastward to the coast, to take ship for the greater shrines beyond the sea. For a pilgrim who had reached Canterbury sometimes found the appetite for pilgrimage, only sharpened and not slaked, and dreamed now of Rome, or of Compostela in distant Spain, or even, the boldest of them, of Jerusalem itself, half a world away. But most were for home, back the way they had come, down the long road, through Harble Down and Ospringe and Rochester and Dartford, to the river and the city and their own beds and their own ordinary lives. And so in the morning they stood in the inn-yard, the whole company that had walked 60 miles as one, and they said their farewells and clasped hands, and a few of them embraced. And the fine widow pressed something into the threadbare priest's hand that he tried to refuse and could not. And the young couple thanked everyone for everything, and the miller, gruff to the last. I found he could not quite say what he wanted to, and said other words instead. And then they went their separate ways out of the yard, in twos and threes, onto the highways that would carry them apart. And the company that had been a single body for 4 days simply dissolved back into the scattered individuals it had been before the root made it whole. That is how it always ended. That is how it was meant to end. But no one who had walked it ever quite forgot the others they had walked it with. The road home is the same track and an entirely different matter. The same mud, the same rivers, the same inns, and the same hills, walked now in the opposite direction with the morning sun behind you instead of ahead, and yet everything about the feeling of it is changed. The dread is gone. The great forward-leaning hope that pulled the outward journey tight, and in its place is something quieter and harder to name, a mixture of contentment and emptiness, of arrival and of ending in the same breath. The body, which had wound itself up for the goal, lets down, and the tiredness that the hope had held at bay comes flooding in, so that the road home is often the harder walking, even though it is the same distance. The legs heavy with the accumulated cost of the whole journey, now that there is no longer anything to spend them on. The badge is on the hat. The flask of holy water hangs at the breast. It is done. And a pilgrim walking home alone, or in a thinned-out remnant of the old company, has time at last to feel what the journey has done to them, to turn over the moment at the shrine, the blaze of the gold, the burden laid down, and to wonder, as the miles unwind backward, whether it will hold, whether the lightness will last, whether the saint heard. The young wife walks home with her hand resting, without her quite deciding it, against her own belly, and tells herself nothing, and hopes everything. The man who laid down the heavy sin walks home, testing the weight of himself the way you test a tooth that has stopped aching, half afraid to find the pain still there, and finds, mile by mile, that it is not, that something has truly lifted, and weeps again on the road for a different reason than he wept upon the hill. They are going home changed. That was the whole idea. You do not walk to Canterbury and come back the person who set out. But before we let the highway go entirely, before the company dwindles over the last hill and the wider world closes back in, I want to walk you onto it one more time, not to get anywhere, not to reach a shrine or beat the dark to a roof, but only to stand a while at the roadside and watch the ordinary life of it go by. Because the journey hurried us, the way a journey does. Always leaning toward the next town and the falling sun, and there are things about the plain daily business of medieval travel that we pass too fast, and I do not want you to miss them. So come and stand with me at the verge of the road on an ordinary morning, with no particular need to be anywhere, and let us simply watch who passes. For our company was never alone on the route. Not really, The way to Canterbury was a busy thoroughfare, one of the great arteries of the kingdom, and at most hours of a working day it carried a steady traffic of every kind of person the age produced, going about every kind of business. So that to stand at the roadside was to watch the whole of medieval society pass by in a slow procession. Here comes a carter first, leading a heavy wagon piled with goods for a market town, the wheels groaning, the oxen or the great patient horses leaning into the load, the carter walking at their heads with a switch and a stream of talk that the beasts ignore. The carter is the lifeblood of the road's other purpose, the one beneath the pilgrimage, which is trade. For these same routes that carried souls to the shrine, carried wool to the ports, and wine up from the coast, and grain to the towns, and every manufactured thing from where it was made to where it was wanted. And the rumble of cartwheels was the sound of an economy moving at the speed of an ox. Behind the carter walks a drover, with a flock of sheep or a small herd of cattle, filling the track from verge to verge, raising dust, being driven to a distant market on their own 4 feet, because there was no other way to move them. And a company of pilgrims caught behind a flock of sheep on a narrow stretch, learned patience whether they wanted to or not. Then comes a man on a good horse, riding fast, and everyone gives way to him, because he is a messenger, and the message he carries may be the king's. The medieval world had no post in our sense, no system of regular delivery, and so a letter or an order or a piece of urgent news travelled the way everything travelled, in the hand of a rider who carried it himself the whole distance, changing horses where he could, riding through the day and sometimes the night, and the sight of a hard-riding messenger was a small event on the road, a thread of the great world's business flashing past the slow pilgrims at 3 times their pace. After him, more slowly, a string of pack horses nose to tail, roped together, each one laden with panniers, led by a merchant's man, the goods too valuable or too far to trust to a cart. The spices and the fine cloth and the small precious things, moved by horse over distances a cart could not manage on the bad highways, and threaded all through this traffic, on foot like our company, are the others of the road's own particular population, the friars in their habits, grey or black or white, according to their order, walking from town to preach and to beg, 2 by 2, their bare feet hard as horn, the pardoners with their relics and their pardons for sale, whom the wise traveller treated with caution, the wandering minstrels with an instrument slung on the back, going where there was a hall that might pay for a song, the journeyman craftsmen tramping between towns in search of work, the beggars, the genuinely poor and the professionally pitiful, working the road for what the travellers would give, and the other pilgrim companies, some going our way and some coming back from Canterbury already, the homecoming ones, wearing the badge and the flask, and calling out, as they passed, that the saint was good and the route ahead was clear, or that it was not. The track was a river of people, and to walk it was to swim, for a few days, in the whole moving stream of the age. And among that stream worth pausing on were the women, because a highway full of travelling women is one of the things about the medieval world that surprises people most. Conditioned as we are to imagine that age as one in which women were kept, always indoors and always under guard, they were not, or not entirely. Women went on pilgrimage in great numbers, and not only as the wives and daughters and maids of travelling men, though many were that, they went as widows of their own means and their own minds as our widow goes, free at last of the husband and the household, and able, perhaps for the first time in a long life, to choose a road and walk it. They went in 2s and 3s of their own, gathering into the company for the safety the company gave. They went as penitents and as petitioners, carrying the same burdens of sin and sorrow and hope that the men carried, and one hope in particular that the men could not carry, for the woman who came to ask the saint for a child, or for safe delivery of the child she already carried, or in thanks for a child the saint was believed to have given, was among the most faithful of all the pilgrims, and the shrines knew it and welcomed her. There were famous women travellers, women who made not one pilgrimage, but many, who had been to the great shrines across the sea and come home to tell of it. Women of strong opinion and loud voice and hard-won worldliness, who knew the routes and the inns and the tricks of the trade better than most men, and were not shy of saying so. The road was, for a woman, one of the very few doors in the wall of medieval life that opened outward, a sanctioned reason to leave the home, to travel, to see, to be for a while her own person on the open road. It came with real danger, the danger every traveller faced, and a particular danger besides, and a woman alone on a bad stretch of highway was a frightened thing with reason. But the company answered much of that, and the badge and the staff and the church's protection answered more, and so the women came in their thousands, and the route was as much theirs as anyone's. And then there were those at the other end of every scale, the poor and the broken and the desperate, for whom the pilgrimage was not a journey undertaken, but a last thing left to try. The genuinely poor walked because they had no horse and no choice, lived on the charity of the Maisons Dieu and the abbeys and the alms of kinder travellers, slept in barns and under hedges when no roof was given, and arrived at the shrine with nothing in their hands but their need. The sick were brought, carried by their families the whole long way, the fevered and the crippled and the failing, borne on litters and in carts and on the backs of those who loved them, in the desperate hope that the saint who had healed so many might heal this one too, and the road must often have been a hard track for them, jolted and cold and far from any comfort, sustained only by the hope at the end of it, and not all of them lived to see the towers on the hill. And there were the penitents proper, those for whom the pilgrimage was a sentence and not a choice, sent onto the road by a confessor or a court to walk off a grave sin, and the gravest of them walked it hard, barefoot in all weathers, or fasting the whole way, or, in the most serious cases, walking in irons, bound with the chains or the rings of penance that they were to wear until the metal wore through, or the saint, by a miracle, struck it off, a sight that stopped the other pilgrims in their tracks, and reminded them, walking comfortably in their good boots, what the route could also be. The pilgrimage held all of them, the comfortable widow and the chained penitent and the dying child, on the one road, under the one sky, bound for the one shrine. That was its strange genius. It made room for everyone, because everyone, in the end, was carrying something. It would be wrong, though, to leave you with the picture of a whole society devoutly and unanimously on the track, because it was not so. And the late 14th century in particular was a time when the practice of pilgrimage itself had begun to draw real and pointed criticism, and a thoughtful traveller of our company would have heard the arguments and perhaps half agreed with some of them. There were those, learned men and plain men both, who looked at the whole enterprise, the relics that may or may not have been what they were claimed to be, the pardoners selling remission like cloth, the badges and the flasks and the holy water bought and sold, the rough good cheer of a pilgrim company that looked at times a great deal more like a holiday than a penance, and asked, sharply, whether any of it had much to do with God at all. Why walk 60 miles to a chest of gold, they said, when God was as near to you in your own parish, in your own prayers, as he was at Canterbury? Why venerate the bones of a dead man and the trinkets of his cult when the living poor stood begging at the shrine's own gate. Was a pilgrimage true devotion, or was it superstition dressed up as devotion? Or was it, for many, simply an excuse to leave home and drink and gossip on the road for a week with the blessing of the church? These were not idle questions, and they were being asked in our pilgrim's own day with growing force by men whose criticism would help in time to bring the whole edifice down. Most of the company would have brushed the arguments aside, or never heard them, or felt in their own hearts that the doubters had never knelt at the shrine and did not know what they were talking about. But the questions were there, on the road, in the air, and they are worth remembering because they remind us that the people of the past were not the credulous children we sometimes imagine, but a society arguing with itself, in which faith and doubt walked the same route side by side, as they always have. Now, let me take you back to the start of one of those days on the track, because anyone used to a modern morning, the alarm, the shower, the coffee, the 100 small machines that wake us and warm us and carry us, has no idea what it was to get up and ready a body for a day of medieval travel. And the difference is one of the truest windows there is into how far we have come and what we have left behind. A traveller woke in the dark, as we have seen, roused by the host before the dawn, and the first sensation of the day was cold, a cold that we, in our heated houses, simply never feel. The deep settled cold of an unheated room at the end of a night, the fire long since banked to a few embers, the air sharp enough to see the breath. There was no leaping out of bed. There was a slow, stiff, reluctant unwrapping from the cloak and the shared warmth of the bedfellows, and a fumbling in the near dark for clothes that had been slept in or laid close to keep a little warmth in them. Because dressing in genuine cold is a thing to be done fast and got over. And the dressing itself was its own slow business, layer upon layer, because medieval clothing was built in layers against a cold. The buildings did nothing to keep out. Next to the skin went the linen, a long shirt or shift, the only garment regularly washed, worn precisely so that the outer clothes, which were almost never washed, need not touch the skin. Over the linen went the body of the clothing, the tunic or the gown of wool. Wool being the great fabric of the age, warm and durable, and made everywhere from the sheep that filled the fields. The legs were covered in hose, separate stockings of cut wool, held up and tied, for there was no garment yet that joined them at the top the way ours do. Over it all, the heavy outer layer, the cloak or the surcoat, and the hood for the hood, not the hat, was the everyday covering of the medieval head. A snug pull-on of wool that warmed the head and neck together and could be thrown back when the sun came out. There were no buttons as we know them in most of this, but lacing and pinning and tying and the long practiced business of getting it all fastened with cold fingers in poor light. A traveller of any means dressed in clothing that was, by our standards, astonishingly expensive cloth was made by hand, every thread spun by hand and woven by hand, so that a single good gown represented weeks of someone's labour and was valued accordingly. Mended endlessly, handed down, left carefully in wills. You did not own much clothing. What you owned, you wore until it could be worn no longer, and then you wore it some more. And on the feet went the shoes, and the shoes deserved their own word, because nothing on a walking pilgrimage mattered more to a body's daily fortune, and nothing was so far from what we would call adequate. The shoes of the age were made of leather, soft and turned and stitched by hand. Low things that came up around the ankle or a little above, with soles of leather too thin, flat leather, with none of the cushioning, and none of the support, and none of the waterproofing that we have come to think of as the bare minimum of a thing worn for walking. There was no left and no right in the making of them. They were straight, and the foot shaped them to itself with wear. A good pair was supple and close-fitting, and when new and dry, even comfortable in its way. But set that thin leather against 60 miles of stony rutted road and days of mud and wet, and you begin to see the trouble. The soles wore through, the wet came in, soaking the foot and softening the skin until it blistered and tore. The lack of any support left the foot to take the full hammering of the hard ground mile after mile, so that the bones of it ached with a deep bruised ache by the day's end, and the morning's first steps were a small ordeal of their own. The pilgrims carried grease to work into the leather against the wet and spare laces, and those who could afford it carried a second pair, for a shoe that failed entirely on the highway was a calamity, leaving a pilgrim to limp on in the ruin of it or barefoot over the stones. And the feet themselves became the great daily preoccupation of the company, tended and compared and worried over at every halt. The blisters lanced and bound, the pressure points padded with what came to hand, the feet bathed in a cold stream at the midday rest, with a groan of relief that came up from the soul. The maisons Dieu and the kindly houses along the way knew this, and the care of a pilgrim's ruined feet was among the first hospitalities they offered. A basin of warm water and a salve and a clean binding being. To a body that had walked all day on failing leather, very nearly as welcome as the bread. We slip our feet into shoes built by clever machines to cradle and cushion and carry us, and we walk on smooth, dry ground, and we think nothing of any of it. They walked to Canterbury on thin leather over stone and mud, and arrived with the feet half ruined, and counted it a small price, and walked home again the same way. Hold that too, the next time a long day leaves your own feet aching. Theirs ached worse, every step of 60 miles, and still they sang. As for washing here, the modern traveller must set aside almost everything they assume, because the medieval relationship to the washing of the body was nothing like ours, and is one of the things people find hardest to believe. There was no daily bath. There was, for most, no bath at all, in any sense we would recognize. Certainly not on the road. What a traveller did in the morning was wash the hands and the face, and this they did do reliably. For the hands especially were washed before and after eating as a matter of strict good manners, and were kept cleaner than we might guess. A basin of cold water, a quick wash of the face and hands, perhaps a rinse of the mouth, and a rub of the teeth with a cloth or a twig. And that was the morning toilet. The rest of the body went unwashed for long stretches as a matter of course, and the whole world smelled accordingly. A fact so universal that no one remarked on it, because everyone was in the same condition, and the nose, in such a world, simply stops noticing what is always there. The hair was combed, for combing was valued, and a fine comb was a thing people owned and treasured, and a traveller would not set out unkempt if they could help it. For appearance mattered, and a tidy head and a clean face were the marks of a respectable person, even on the road. But the deep, frequent, whole-body cleanliness that we take for granted as the baseline of human dignity simply did not exist, and could not, in a world where heating water meant carrying it and burning fuel for it, and where the very idea of bathing was tangled up with notions of health and morality that pulled in several directions at once. They were not filthy by their own standards. They were perfectly clean by their own standards. Their standards were not ours, and a night on the route would teach a time traveller that faster than any book. And then, dressed and washed as far as washing went, the traveller ate, and the food of the morning on the track was a hurried and frugal thing, for the great rule was to set out early, and the great meal of the day came later. There might be bread and ale standing in the inn-yard, or a little of yesterday's cheese from the scrip eaten as they walked, or, in a good house, a bowl of something warm. But breakfast, as we know it, a settled morning meal, was not yet quite the fixed institution it would become, and on the road especially, the morning food was fuel taken on the move. The real eating deferred to the midday halt and the evening fire. What there always was, morning and noon and night, was ale. I cannot stress enough how central ale was to the medieval day, and how unlike our drinking it was. The ale that everyone drank, from the youngest child to the oldest grandmother, all day, every day, was not the strong stuff of a modern evening, but a weak, thin, lightly fermented brew, made fresh in nearly every household and sold at any alehouse. Drunk because the water could not be trusted, and because the ale carried a little nourishment and a little cheer, and because there was, simply, nothing else. A traveller drank ale at each meal, and between meals, and so did everyone they met, and the alehouse, a private house, often a widow's, with a bush hung out over the door to show fresh ale, was ready, was as common a roadside fixture as the church, a place to rest and drink and hear the news of the next stretch of road. To travel medieval England was to travel from ale to ale. The food of the route and the inn, when the real meals came, was governed by two great facts, and the first was the season, and the second was the church. By season, because there were no other means, what you ate was what was available now, in this month, in this place, and the medieval year was a calendar of feast and want. The autumn, a time of plenty when the harvest was in, and the beasts that could not be kept through winter were slaughtered, and the larders were full. The late winter and early spring, a hungry time when the stores ran low and the new growth had not yet come. The whole population living far closer to the edge of real hunger than we can easily imagine. A traveller in autumn ate well, a traveller in March ate thin. And by the church, because the Christian calendar laid a strict pattern of fasting over the whole year that everyone, including travellers, was bound to keep. There were the great fasts of Lent, the long weeks before Easter, when no meat was eaten at all by anyone, and there were the weekly fasts, Friday above all, and often Wednesday and Saturday too, when meat was forbidden and fish took its place. So a pilgrim's diet was shaped by the day of the week as much as by the inn's larder. On a Friday, no matter how the meat smelled from the kitchen, it was fish, or eggs, or the plain things that broke no fast. And a devout company would no more have eaten flesh on a Friday than they would have struck the host. Fish, then, was eaten in vast quantities, fresh where it could be had, but mostly salted or dried, the salt cod and the salt herring that were the great preserved foods of the age, soaked and stewed into something edible, for the taste of which a modern palate would find a trial, and which a medieval one accepted as simply the taste of a Friday. I have mentioned the horses, and they deserve a moment of their own, because the relationship between the medieval traveller and their animals was close and constant, and unlike anything most of us know. A horse was not a luxury exactly, but it was a serious possession, the most valuable thing many a traveller owned. And to own a good horse was to own freedom and speed and status all at once. But it was also a responsibility that never slept. A horse on the road had to be fed, and feeding it was a real cost. Oats and hay that the inns sold dear, for a working horse ate a great deal, and a hungry horse soon became a useless one. It had to be watered and rested, and its feet checked, for a horse that went lame on a bad track could end a journey or ruin a fortune. It had to be stabled at night and guarded, for a horse was exactly the kind of valuable, portable, sellable thing that thieves loved best. And it had to be understood, its moods and its fears read, for the highways were full of things that frightened a horse. The rush of a river crossing, the press of a market town, a flapping cloth, a sudden dog, and a rider who could not manage a frightened animal at a bad moment could come to grief. The walkers in a company, who owned no horse, were spared all this, and there was a quiet democracy in it. For on a really bad stretch of road, the proud rider on the costly horse and the poor pilgrim on foot moved at exactly the same pace. And the rider had the worry of the animal besides. Many a pilgrim of middling means looked at the trouble and expense of a horse and decided their own 2 feet, slow as they were the better bargain after all. And then there were the dogs, which I have mentioned in passing, but which were a genuine and constant feature of the road, because every farmstead and every village kept dogs, working dogs and guard dogs, half wild and territorial. And a stranger passing on the track was exactly what they existed to bark at, and too often to chase. A traveller learned to read a village by its dogs, to keep the staff handy and the pace steady through the worst of them. Neither running, which invited pursuit, nor showing fear, which invited worse. The staff that helped you walk and tested the fords was more than anything else, the means that kept the dogs off, and an old hand on the road knew just how to hold it, and just how to use it to turn a snarling farm dog without provoking the whole pack. It sounds a small matter, the dogs, but it was the kind of small, constant friction that filled the medieval traveller's day, and that we, gliding sealed through the landscape, have entirely forgotten. The endless, low-level negotiation with a world that was not built for the stranger and did not particularly welcome them. The dogs and the dust and the bad ground and the suspicious villagers and the tolls and the weather. The 1,000 small frictions of moving a human body across the medieval land, every one of which had to be met and managed and walked through, mile after mile after mile. And here is a thing about the ordinary travelling day that is almost impossible for us to feel from the inside, because we wear the answer to it on our wrists and carry it in our pockets and glance at it 100 times a day without thinking. Question of time, of how a medieval traveller knew what hour it was. And the answer is that mostly they did not in the way we mean, and did not need to. There were no clocks to speak of in the lives of ordinary people. A few great churches and towns had begun, in these very decades, to raise the first mechanical clocks, marvels of iron wheels that struck the hours. But they were rare and costly wonders, and the traveller on the road had nothing of the sort, and would not have known what to do with it. Time on the highway was told by the sun and by the bells, and between them they were enough. The sun gave the broad shape of the day, its rising and its height and its westering and its setting, the great arc by which a traveller reckoned how much walking was done and how much daylight remained. Reading the sky the way we read a clock face, with a practised glance that needed no thought. And the bells gave the finer divisions, because the bells of the church rang out the hours of prayer across the whole land, and those offices, the canonical hours, were the medieval day's true skeleton. For the church had divided the day and the night into a fixed round of services, the offices, each at its appointed hour, and the bells of every monastery and many a parish rang to mark them, so that the sound of a bell drifting across the fields told a traveller not just that it was time to pray, but what part of the day it was. There were the dark offices of the night, and the early morning before and around the dawn. There was the office of the first hour as the working day began, and the third hour through the morning, and the sixth when the sun stood at its highest, which gave us our very word for the midday rest, and the ninth hour through the afternoon, which crept earlier and earlier over the centuries until it came to rest at the middle of the day, and so handed down to us, its first meaning quite worn away, the very word we still use for that turning of the day. There was the office of the evening as the light failed, and the last office as the day closed and the world prepared for the dark. A traveller did not carry the hour. The traveller walked through a landscape that announced the hour. Again and again, in the voice of bells from every steeple within earshot, a great slow chiming framework laid over the whole country and the whole day, dividing the light into known and named portions. And so the company reckoned its day not in minutes, and not in numbered hours of equal length, for even the hours were not equal as ours are. The daylight simply divided into its portions, whether the day was long or short, so that an hour of summer daylight was a longer thing than an hour of winter. But in these great soft divisions, marked by the sun overhead and the bells on the wind, to set out at the first light, to halt when the sun stood high and the distant bell rang the sixth hour, to press for shelter as the light slanted long and gold and the evening bell sounded somewhere ahead, to be safe within doors before the last bell and the fall of the dark. That was the shape of the travelling day. And it was a shape given, not by any machine, but by the turning sky and the voices of 100 bells, and a person who lived by it knew the time in their body and their bones in a way that we, glancing at our glowing numbers, have entirely lost. The medieval traveller was poorer than us in almost every measurable way. But they walked through a day that sang the hours to them from every tower on the horizon, and there is something in that I cannot help but find I envy. Lying here in the silent dark, with the hour a cold number on a screen, it is worth saying plainly what all this cost, because the question of money ran under every mile of the road, as surely as the question of weather ran over it. And a pilgrimage was, for most who made it, a real and carefully reckoned expense. The coins themselves were few and simple, the silver penny above all, the workhorse of the age, and its halves and quarters, the halfpenny and the farthing, cut sometimes literally from the penny, and above them the larger silver pieces, and for the wealthy, the gold. And a traveller carried these in small worn quantities, and guarded them like life, because there was no replacing a stolen purse on the route, and no drawing more from anywhere. What did the track take from that purse? A night's bed and board at an inn, a few pence. A meal, a penny or two. Feed and stabling for a horse, more than the man it carried cost to keep. The tolls at the bridges and the gates, a coin here and a coin there, small but ceaseless. A candle at the shrine, an offering at each station. The price of the badge and the flask to carry home. None of it ruinous on its own. All of it adding up across 4 days and 4 nights and 60 miles to a sum that an ordinary working person felt keenly and saved for and counted out with care, so that the poorer pilgrims walked further on less, slept rougher, ate thinner, and leaned harder on the charity that the road was built to provide. A pilgrimage was, among everything else it was, a thing you budgeted for, a purchase as much as a prayer. And the prudent traveller set out with a clear and slightly anxious idea of exactly how much highway their money would buy. And what did the money buy them to walk through? Kent, in spring, which is as fair a county as England owns, and the route we have travelled ran through the better part of it. So let me set the country itself around you for a moment, before the dark comes down. East of the river, the land rises gently into low chalk hills, the North Downs rolling and open and high, with the turf cropped short by sheep and the larks going up invisibly into the blue and the views from the tops, running for miles over a patchwork of fields and woods and the silver thread of a river in its valley. Between the hills lie the orchards for which Kent was already famous, the apple and the cherry and the pear, and a pilgrim who took the road at blossom time walked for days through a country gone white and pink. To the trees in flower as far as the eye could carry, the petals coming down on the track like a warm and scented snow, and the bees loud in the branches, and the whole of it almost unbearably lovely in a way that the foul highways and aching feet could not quite spoil. There were the deep green woods, the blean and the rest, dense and old and dark inside, that the roots skirted or plunged through, and that a traveller was always glad to be clear of. There were the villages, each one a huddle of timber and thatch around a church and a green and a pond, the smoke standing up from the roofs, the people at their endless work in the fields around, looking up to watch the pilgrims pass. There were the rivers in their valleys, the Darrant and the Medway and the Stour, each one a crossing and an obstacle, and to the eye, a beauty. It was a made landscape, every acre of it worked and known and used, no wilderness left in it to speak of, the whole country a vast slow garden tended by hand for 1,000 years, and to walk through it at the pace of the body, in the open air, through the turning of a spring day, was to know a place in a way that no faster traveller ever can. The pilgrims complained of the road, but many of them, I think, half fell in love with the country it ran through, and carried the memory of those blossoming miles home with them, along with the badge and the holy water, a thing they had not gone looking for and were given anyway. And since we are lingering, let me give you properly the thing that a single sentence could not hold when we hurried through it the first time, which is the evening at the inn, because the evening was the reward. The whole hard day was walked toward, and it deserves more than a passing word. Understand first what the body felt as it came in, off the track at dusk, the particular bone-deep relief of stopping, of being out of the wind and the wet, of setting the pack down inside the door and feeling the shoulders rise an inch now that nothing pulled on them, of lowering a ruined body onto a bench by a fire and knowing that the walking for today was over. There is a pleasure in that which the comfortable can scarcely know, because it is the pleasure of relief, and relief is bought only with prior suffering. And the pilgrims had suffered the day's full measure of mud and cold and aching feet to earn it. So they arrived spent, and they sat by the fire, and they let the warmth work into them, and the wet wool of their cloaks began to steam, and the smell of it joined the smell of the smoke and the pot and the close-packed bodies, and slowly, by degrees, the day's hardship melted off them, and a kind of glow rose in its place. Then the food, ladled steaming into the bowls they carried, the thick pottage and the dark bread plain fare, eaten with the bottomless hunger of people who had walked all day, and washed down with the ale that came round and round. And as the bowls emptied, and the ale did its gentle work, the room loosened and warmed and grew loud. And here is where the real treasure of the evening lay, because the medieval world made its own entertainment out of nothing but voices, and a company gathered round a fire, with the day's walking done, and the ale flowing was entertainment's natural home. Someone would tell a tale. There was always someone with a tale, and a good teller was prized above rubies on the road, and the tales were of every kind, the holy legends of the saints and their wonders, told with proper reverence. The old romances of knights and quests and ladies, told with relish, the broad and bawdy stories that set the whole room roaring, and made the parson stare into his ale and pretend not to listen. The ghost stories and the wonder stories. Tales of far countries and stranger things that held a firelit room wrapped. And the songs, because singing was as natural to them as speaking, and a company that had sung to keep its feet moving on the highway sang again by the fire for the pure pleasure of it. The old songs everyone knew with the choruses everyone could join, rising up into the smoke-blackened rafters, voice on voice, the miller's bellow and the widow's surprising sweetness, and the young couple's laughter, all woven into the one warm noise. The talk ran on between the tales and the songs, the comparing of the day, the boasting and the grumbling. The news traded with strangers from other companies bound other ways. The whole rich human business of a room full of tired people who have decided, for one evening, to be happy. It was not refined. It was not quiet. The grand among them would not have kept such company at home for a moment. But on the road, by the fire, with the dark shut outside, and the ale within, and a good tale running, it was as warm and human and good a thing as the medieval age had to offer, and the pilgrims knew it, and they leaned into it, and they were slow, night after night, to let it end and climb the stair to the cold and the straw and the strangers' beds. Hold that fire in your mind. That is the warm heart that beat at the centre of each hard day on the route. There is one more thing I want you to feel before we let the track go, and it is the hardest to convey, because it is the very air the medieval world breathed, and so the thing they themselves would never have thought to describe, the sheer sensory texture of the time, the way it sounded and smelled and felt to a living body, which was so utterly different from our own padded and deodorized and quiet age. Begin with the smell, because the medieval world itself was, to our noses, overwhelmingly and unceasingly pungent. The smell of wood smoke over everything, from every fire in every house. The smell of animals everywhere, because animals were everywhere, in the streets and the yards and often the houses. The smell of horse and ox and pig and dung that was simply the smell of human settlement. The smell of unwashed bodies and unwashed clothes, of tanneries and breweries and the open channels that carried away what a town would rather be rid of cooking and rot and earth and rain. To walk into a medieval town was to walk into a wall of smell that would stagger a modern person and that the medieval person did not notice at all. And the sound, an age with no engines, no machines, no recorded anything, a time whose loudest regular sound was the church bell, which rang the hours and the offices and the alarms and the celebrations, and was the great voice over every town and village, audible for miles, ordering the whole day by its tolling. Beneath the bells, the sounds were all human and animal and natural. Voices, hooves, wheels, the cries of trades and traders, birdsong, wind, water, the ring of a hammer, a snatch of song. It was by our standards a hushed age and a dark one, unlit, because when the sun went down the night was very nearly total, lit only by the moon and the small, expensive flames of fire and candle. So that the dark was a real presence, a thing that fell and filled the land and shaped the hours, and the coming of light at dawn was a daily relief, and the lengthening of the days in spring a cause for real rejoicing. We have banished the night and the quiet and the smell, and gained enormously by it, and lost, perhaps, a little something too, a closeness to the turning of the day and the year, a knowing of the land through the body, that our ancestors on the road had whether they wanted it or not, and that we have to work, now, to find again. That is the world they walk through. Hold it a moment longer. The smell of the smoke, and the sound of the far-off bell, and the dark coming down over the highway. And now let it go, gently, and let the company walk on toward home. And running under all of it, under the staff and the company, and the cleared verges, and every other earthly defence the traveller could muster, there was prayer, the constant quiet prayer of people who knew how thin their protections were, and who, they believed, held the rest. They prayed setting out, and they prayed on the route, and they prayed lying down in strange beds, and they had their particular helpers in heaven for the particular dangers of the way. Above them all stood the great patron of travellers, the giant saint, who, the legend told, had carried the Christ child across a flooded river on his own shoulders and felt the whole weight of the world grow heavy upon him as he waded. And so he became the protector of all who must cross water and walk far. And his image was painted huge on the wall of church after church along the highways, set where a traveller passing the open door could see it at a glance, because it was believed that to look upon his likeness was to be kept safe from sudden death for that whole day. A pilgrim on the track looked for that painted giant in every church they passed, and was glad of the sight of him, a day's safety bought with a single upward glance. They wore small images of him and of other helpers, and they murmured the old travelling prayers worn smooth by generations of frightened mouths, and they touched the relics where they could, and they trusted, in the end, that the highway they walked for God's sake would be watched over by God in the walking. It did not always spare them. The fords still drowned, and the robbers still struck, and the fever still came. But the prayer was not really a transaction, a coin paid for a guarantee. It was something else. Something we still reach for in the dark hours, the simple human act of placing what you cannot control into hands larger than your own. And walking on anyway, they did a great deal of that on the road to Canterbury. Perhaps it is the most human thing they did. And think, last of all, of the homecoming, of what it was to come back. Because the journey did not end at the city gate or the parish boundary, but in the welcome that waited beyond it. A returned pilgrim was a small marvel in a medieval village, a person who had gone out to the edge of the known world and come back, and they were met with a curiosity and a respect that the badge on the hat had earned them. They had seen Canterbury, they had knelt at the shrine of the great saint. They carried the holy water that might heal a neighbour's child, and they carried something rarer still, which was news and story from beyond the 10 miles that bounded most lives. What the route was like, what the city was like, what wonders the cathedral held, who they had met, and what had befallen them. The village gathered to hear it by the fire of a winter evening, and the returned pilgrim told it and told it again, the tale growing a little surer and a little finer with each telling, until it settled into the family store of remembered tales and was handed down. To have made the pilgrimage was a mark a person carried for the rest of their life, and was known by, the way a soldier is known by a campaign or a sailor by a voyage. And for the pilgrim themselves there was the quiet private knowledge, kept under the public story, of what had truly happened at the shrine. The burden laid down, the hope entrusted, the moment on the hill, a knowledge they might never speak of plainly to anyone, but that had changed the shape of their inward life and would walk with them, silently, to the end of their days. That was the last and truest souvenir of Canterbury, carried home by every one of them, worth more than the badge and the flask and all the rest. Not something you could show, a thing you simply now were, I want to step back now, while the company walks home and the light is still good, and show you how large a matter we have been walking through tonight. Because the road to Canterbury was one track among very many, and the pilgrimage of our little company was one of millions. And once you see the whole pattern of it, you see something close to the beating heart of the medieval world. All across Europe, the highways ran like this one, beaten deep by the feet of the faithful, threading shrine to shrine and city to city, and along them moved a constant human tide. There was Canterbury for the English, and there were 100 lesser shrines in England, besides every region with its own holy site and its own local saint who answered local prayers. There was Rome, where the bones of the apostles lay, the goal of the longest and hardest of all the journeys an ordinary European might dream of. There was the shrine of St. James at Compostela, in the far northwest of Spain, reached by routes that gathered pilgrims from the whole of the continent into great rivers of walkers flowing west toward the apostles' tomb. And there was Jerusalem, the holy city itself, half a world away, across sea and desert and danger. The journey that a man might give years of his life and most of his fortune to make once before he died. The whole of Christendom was stitched together by these roads, and the inns and abbeys and hospitals that fed and sheltered the pilgrims, and the badges and the relics and the stories that travelled the tracks with them. A vast, slow circulation of people and faith and coin, moving at the pace of walking feet, that bound a continent of villages into something that knew itself as one. And it was, for the ordinary person, an extraordinary opening in a life that was otherwise almost entirely closed. Think of what her medieval village life was. You were born in a place, and you lived in that place. And you would in all likelihood die in that same spot, within a few miles of where you drew your first breath, knowing, intimately, a tiny patch of the earth and almost nothing of the rest of it. You would never see a city, never see the sea, never see a building larger than your parish church, never meet a person from beyond the next valley, never in your whole life travel further than your own legs could carry you home again by nightfall. The pilgrimage broke that open. It was, for vast numbers of people, the one great journey of a lifetime, the one time the walls of the known world drew back, the first sight of London, the first crossing of a great river by a great bridge, the first city, the first cathedral soaring up out of the rooftops, the first conversation with a knight or a merchant or a stranger from a county whose name you had only heard. People came home from Canterbury, not only shriven and lightened, but enlarged, having seen with their own eyes that the world was bigger and stranger and more various than the round of fields they had always known. And that knowledge, carried back into 1,000 villages, was its own quiet kind of transformation. The road gave them their soul's business. Yes, but it also gave them the world, in the only dose most of them would ever get. And now I have to tell you what became of it, because the highway we have walked tonight no longer leads where it led, and the shrine that blazed at the end of it is not there anymore. For all its power and all its centuries and all its mountains of gold, the cult of St. Thomas came, in the end, to a sudden and total stop, and the man who stopped it was a King of England, as the man who made it had been killed at the wish of a King of England. There is a grim symmetry in that the saint who became a saint by defying a king should be unmade, centuries later, by another. In the great upheaval of religion that swept England in the years after our pilgrims walked, when the old faith was torn down and remade, and the monasteries were dissolved and their wealth taken by the crown, the shrine of St. Thomas, the richest and most famous in the land, was a particular target. The king's men came to Canterbury, and they took the shrine apart. The gold was melted down and carted away, the jewels prized out and carried off. The great ruby that a king of France had given set, it was said, into a royal ring. The saint's bones were removed, and by most accounts, scattered or burned, so that no trace of them should remain to draw the faithful. The very name of St. Thomas was ordered, struck out of the books, his feast abolished, his images destroyed, the whole vast apparatus of his cult dismantled and forbidden in the space of a few years. And the pilgrims simply stopped coming. The road that had hummed with their feet for 3.5 centuries fell quiet. The inns that had grown fat on them dwindled. And the spot in the Trinity Chapel, where the shrine had stood, where the gold had blazed, and the pilgrims had wept and laid down their burdens, became, and remains to this day, an empty place. A bare patch of worn floor between the candlestands, marked now only by the deep hollows that the pilgrims' knees had pressed into the stone of the steps. Climbing toward a shrine that is no longer there. The hollows are still there. You can see them. The feet that wore them are 600 years gone, and the gold they climb toward is melted and scattered and lost. But the stone remembers the knees. That, in the end, is what survives of the whole blazing edifice. Not the gold, which men took, but the marks that longing left in stone, which no one could take, because no one thought them worth the taking. And maybe that is the point to hold on to, as the night draws in and the journey closes. Because it would be easy to look back at these people across the gulf of 600 years and see only the strangeness, the relics and the holy water, the belief in a saint's bones, the willingness to walk for days to kneel before a chest of gold. And it was strange, much of it, to our eyes. But underneath the strangeness, if you let yourself look, that the people on that road are not strange at all, they are us. They carried burdens they did not know how to carry alone, and they went looking for a place to set them down. And they were willing to walk a very long way and suffer a good deal to find it. They wanted to be forgiven for what they had done. They wanted the people they loved to be safe and well. They wanted the griefs of their lives to mean something, to be received by a power larger than themselves. They wanted, walking through the dark and the mud, the company of others walking the same way. None of that has gone out of the world. We carry our burdens differently now, and we look for different places to lay them down. And most of us no longer believe that a route ends at the feet of a saint who can lift them, but the carrying and the longing and the wanting somewhere to put it all down. That is exactly as it was. The road has changed. The heart that walked it has not. And there is something steadying in that, I think, almost like comfort, in lying here in the dark and knowing that across 6 centuries the same human ache walked the same track under the same stars, looking for the same thing we are all, in our way, still looking for. They found it, or believe they found it, at the end of 60 miles. We are allowed to hope we will find it too, wherever our own highways run. So let the route empty now. Let the company that we walked with go on home and dwindle into the distance until the last of them is gone over the hill, and let the track lie quiet behind them in the long spring evening. As a highway lies quiet when the day's travellers have all found their roof, and the dust has settled and there is no one left upon it, but the swifts going over and the shadows reaching across from the cleared verges. Let your mind drift back along the whole of it, as you can only do at the end, when there is nowhere left to get to and nothing left to fear. Back over the last hill where they wept, back through Harbledown where the lepers held out the relic. Back along the high chalk road through the orchards, and down to the bridge at Rochester with the brown river sliding under it, and on to the inn at Dartford with its fire and its straw beds and its strangers, and back, all the way back, to the dark yard of the Tabard at Southwark before the dawn, where it all began, where the lantern hung by the stable door and threw its light in long smears on the wet cobbles, and the company gathered in the cold to set out into the unknown. It is all gone now. Of course, the Tabard is gone, The route in its old form is gone, paved over and built upon and forgotten. The shrine is gone, the gold scattered, the saint's name, a thing in old books. The people are gone, the knight and the widow, and the miller and the young wife with her secret hope. Every one of them dead and buried these 600 years, their names unknown to us, their faces unrecorded, their griefs and their hopes and their 4 days on the road, dissolved into the great silence out of which almost everyone who has ever lived now looks back at us, if they look at all. And yet here we are, you and I, in the dark, having walked the whole of it with them. That is the strange grace of it. They are gone, and the track is gone, and the world they walk through is gone, and still, tonight, for a few hours, we put ourselves into their shoes and felt the road under our feet, and the weight on our shoulders, and the rain on our necks, and the joy on the hill, and for that little while they were not gone at all. They walked again, in us. That is the nearest thing to not dying that the dead are given, to be walked with again by the living. And we have given it to them tonight, this scattered band of us, all across the world, in the dark. And now there is nothing more to reach, and nowhere left to walk to, and you can let all of it go. The journey is done. The company is home. The shrine has been seen, and the burden has been laid down, and the badge is pinned to the hat, and the road behind us runs back 60 miles through the dark to an inn yard at Southwark that has not existed for 600 years. And there is nothing left for either of us to do tonight but rest. So let yourself begin to settle now, as the company settled by the fire on that last good evening, with the walking over and the destination reached, and the whole long effort of the day finally, blessedly, behind them. You do not have to hold anything anymore. You do not have to carry anything, or get anywhere, or keep the dark at bay, or watch the route for danger. All of that is finished. You can set it down, as they set their packs down inside the door of the inn, and feel the weight of it lift off your shoulders, and let your body grow heavy and warm and still. Let the road empty behind us. Picture it as it looks in the last of a long spring evening, when all the day's travellers have found their roof and gone in. The broad rutted way lying quiet and pale between the cleared verges, the dust settling, the light going slowly golden and then grey, the swifts cutting their last circles overhead and then gone, the hedges falling still. The whole long way from Canterbury back to the river emptying of people mile by mile until there is no one on it at all, only the path itself, resting its day's work behind it for the day. And let your own mind empty in the same slow way, the thoughts of the day settling and stilling like the dust, the things you were carrying when you lay down loosening their grip, one by one, and drifting off down the empty route into the dark, until there is little left in you that needs attending to, no problem to solve, nothing to hold, only the warmth of where you are, and the dark coming down soft and kind over everything. Let your breathing find the rhythm of the route, slow and even and unhurried, as the company breathed walking the long flat stretches where there was nowhere to hurry to, and the only thing to do was walk. The easy swinging unhurried pace that ate the miles without effort, the breath coming and going, as steady as footfalls on a good road, in and out, slower with each one, deeper with each one, the whole tired, contented body sinking a little further into rest with every breath you let go. There is no distance left to cover. The pace can slacken all the way to stillness. Now, let it. Let each breath out be a little longer than the one before and a little softer, and feel how the body, when the journey is over and the roof is found and there is nothing left to fear, knows how to do this all by itself, knows how to let go, knows how to sink down into the deep, warm, dark, and rest. Think back over the whole of it, gently, the way you drift back over a journey at the very edge of sleep, not trying to hold any of it, just letting the images rise and soften and dissolve. The lantern in the inn-yard before dawn, throwing its light in long smears on the wet cobbles. The company gathering in the cold and the dark, by ones and twos, the knight and the widow, and the miller and the young wife. The gate, and the first step onto the road, and the smoke of London falling away behind you at the watering place. The highway running east into the rising sun, broad and rutted and full of strangers. The talk and the songs that carried the miles. The midday halt in the grass, with the bread and the ale and the low sun on closed eyes. The first town at dusk, and the fire, and the steam of the pot, and the faces. Let them rise, and let them soften, and let them go. The second morning in the dark and the cold, the stiff, silent, shuffling start. The sun coming up bright on your back, and the body remembering how to walk. The bridge at Rochester with the brown river sliding under it, and the great tower rising over the town. The high chalk route through the orchards in their blossom. The petals coming down like sweet-scented snow, the larks invisible in the blue. The houses of charity along the way, the bowl of pottage given freely, the kindness of strangers who owed you nothing and fed you anyway. The lepers at Harbledown holding out the relic with hands you would have shrunk from anywhere else. And the hill, the brow of the last hill, where the valley opened out below and the towers of the cathedral stood up pale and immense against the sky, and the company stopped as if a hand had been laid on it, and wept. Let it rise, and soften, and go. The city, and the crowd, and the great church filling the sky. The cool dim inside, the candles burning in their hundreds, the chant drifting from beyond the screen, the smell of wax and incense and old stone, the place of the murder under your feet, the crypt in the dark, and the first small tomb. The worn steps climbing toward the light, the hollows pressed into the stone by 600 years of knees, the windows full of coloured miracles burning in the morning sun, and the shrine, the cover rising on its ropes with a clatter of small silver bells, and the blaze of gold and jewels and fire revealed all at once, and the whole company falling to its knees, and the burden at last set down. Let it rise one last time, and let it soften, and let it go, all of it, down the long road into the dark, until there is nothing left to picture, and no weight left to hold, and only the warmth and the hush and the slow, even breathing remain. You are not on the track anymore. You are exactly where you are, warm and safe and still, with the day's journey behind you and nothing ahead of you now but sleep. The pilgrims are 6 centuries gone, and their highway is gone, and their shrine is gone, and yet some small kind thing passed between us and them tonight, across all that distance, in the silence, and now they can rest. As they rested on that last good night in Canterbury, with the bells ringing close at hand, and the journey done, and you can rest too. The candle is burning down. Let it. The fire is sinking to embers. Let it. The dark is coming up soft and full in the corners of the room, and there is nothing in it to fear. No danger on the road, no menace in the night, only rest, only quiet. Only the slow, easy settling of a body that has come a long way and is finally allowed to stop. So let your shoulders go heavy, let your hands go loose and heavy and open, as a sleeping hand falls open and lets go of all it held. Let the weight of your head sink down into whatever holds it. and the long muscles of your legs, which have carried you so far through so many days. Let them lengthen and soften and rest. Feel how warm you are. Feel how still. Feel the breath going in and out all by itself, slower and softer and deeper, asking nothing of you, carrying you down by gentle stages into sleep, as the route carried the pilgrims down off the last hill into the valley, easily, unhurriedly. The destination drawing closer with every step until there is no more journey to make. You are nearly there now. You are almost down. There is nothing left to do, and nowhere left to go, and no weight left to carry. And the dark is kind, and the night is long, and you are allowed, now, to let go of the whole of it, and sleep. Before you go all the way down, one last small and quiet thing, and then I will leave you to the dark. If walking these old roads in the deep of the small hours is something that brings you any rest, then you are always welcome to come along again, whenever you like. And I will keep finding these journeys into the past and laying them out as gently as I can for evenings exactly like this one. There is no hurry about it, and no task you need to do. The track will be here, and the next one will find you when it is ready, and the few hours we have spent together tonight on the way to Canterbury can be the first of many such evenings. Or simply a single quiet night that did its work and asked for no more than that. Either way, I am glad you walked it with me. That is all. You can let it go now. The highway is empty. The company is sleeping. The candle has burned down to a thread of light, and now to nothing. And the dark is complete and soft and warm all around you, and there is nothing left in the whole of the night but your own slow breathing, carrying you down, and gently down, into sleep. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.